Chapter 1, River of Time. Long before pyramids scraped the sky, before the names of kings echoed through eternity, there was only the river. The Nile, long and winding, moved not with speed but with rhythm, a pulse that matched the heartbeat of the land. Each year, as if breathing, it would rise from its banks and spill itself into the soil, leaving behind dark, rich silt. To those who lived along its edges, this flood was not destruction. It was salvation. In a world of endless desert, it meant food, growth, and the promise of another season. The people of this land learned to wait. They measured their lives by the Nile's return, their calendars drawn from its behavior. Planting began when the waters withdrew. Harvest came when the land was dry again. In between, they watched, prayed, and prepared. Over time, they saw patterns. The stars above seemed to speak in tandem with the waters below. When Sirius rose before the dawn, they knew the flood was near. The heavens and the river were joined in one silent agreement to sustain life. In these ancient rhythms, time didn't tick forward. It circled. The Nile did not rush like other rivers. It moved slowly, curling south to north, against what seems natural, reminding all that Egypt was born not in chaos, but in balance. Where other lands feared floods, Egypt celebrated them. And from this rhythm, this cycle of giving and waiting, a civilization would be born. One that would learn not just to survive but to listen, to build, to dream in stone. It is here, in the slow breath of water across earth, that the story of the pharaohs begins. Not with gold or war, but with patience. With the river that knew when to rise and when to fall. With the Nile, when stone remembered water. Before temples, before scrolls, before the first royal name was etched into a wall, there were only people and stone. These early people, farmers, hunters, wanderers of the land, knew the Nile as a lifeline. But they also knew it could disappear. Drought came, water retreated, crops failed. The river gave, and sometimes the river withheld. So they began to leave signs behind. Marks in stone, carvings in bone, stretches of rock etched with images of cattle, of birds, of flowing water. In this way, memory was stored not in words but in pictures. And in these images, we find the beginnings of civilization. These were not yet cities, but they were communities. People who remembered together, who shared stories of floods, of good seasons, of lean ones too. And slowly, their gaze turned upward, toward the stars, and inward, toward the spirit. They built homes from mud brick, simple and firm. They buried their dead with care, tucking offerings beside the bodies, beads, bowls, small jars of food. These were not pharaohs, but their ancestors, people who already felt that death was not an end, but a crossing. And so they prepared for it gently and with purpose. As seasons passed and knowledge grew, they began to shape the land itself. They built canals to guide the flood, dikes to protect homes, fields laid in grid-like order to catch the river's gift. In doing so, they learned control not through domination but through understanding. They learned that to shape water was to shape life. And then came stone, first rough, then smooth, upright pillars, stone circles, temples not for gods yet, but for time, to mark the solstices, to trace the moon's phases. The desert kept what the people carved. Unlike wood, unlike cloth, stone did not rot. It stayed. And so, the memory of water was kept in rock. And the idea of forever was born, Kemet and Dishret. In the beginning, the land was split not by lines or kings, but by color. To the Egyptians, it was simple. Kemet, the black land, was where life lived. It was the ribbon of rich soil left behind by the Nile's flood. Here, fields of barley swayed, and dates ripened under the sun. Cattle grazed, and people sang songs to honor the harvest. It was green. It was dark. It was alive. Beyond this narrow band of life stretched Dishret, the red land, the desert, wide and unforgiving, where wind etched the rocks and sand shifted like restless thought. Few dared live here, but even this harsh world had purpose. It protected Egypt like a natural wall. It was where gold hid in the mountains, and where the sun god rode his chariot across the sky each day. It was dry, yes, but not dead. It was sacred in its own way. The duality of Egypt, black and red, life and death, wet and dry, became the foundation of everything. It was not seen as a struggle, but a balance. One needed the other. Upper Egypt, to the south, held the narrow valley where the Nile sliced through cliffs. Lower Egypt, to the north, spread out in wide marshes and delta. Two lands, one river, two crowns, one throne. Every pharaoh who would one day rise to power would bear both symbols, the lotus of the south and the papyrus of the north, the white crown and the red. To rule Egypt was to keep these opposites in harmony, not to choose one but to honor both. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a bridge, a keeper of balance between Kemet and Dishret, between the pulse of life and the silence of sand. Even the gods reflected this duality. Isis and Osiris, representing fertility and resurrection, lived alongside Set, the god of chaos. Ra brought light, while the underworld waited quietly below. And so the people watched the sunset not with fear, but with understanding. Night was not the enemy, it was part of the cycle. Like the flood, it would return, and with it the promise of morning. The god of the river. To the people of Egypt, the Nile was not just a river. It was a living god. Happy, the one who came with the flood, who arrived in blue skin and wore papyrus and lotus on his head. He was not the most powerful god. He did not rule the sky or the underworld, but he was constant, reliable. He brought the flood every year and with it life. And so they praised him with songs, with offerings, with temples raised in his name. When the waters were generous, Egypt flourished. Crops grew thick. Trade flowed. Cities expanded. And when the waters were thin, fear spread like shadow. Was Happy angry? Had something gone wrong in the order of things? And so priests watched the river carefully. They measured its height with nilometers, stone steps carved to track the flood's rise. They read omens in its color, its speed, its silence. The pharaoh, too, was linked to the Nile. He was not just a ruler, but a divine presence, chosen by the gods to keep Ma'at, the sacred order of the world. If the flood came late or too low, people looked not just to the sky, but to their king. Had he angered the gods? Had the balance been broken? The river judged the land, and through it judged its leaders. Yet the Nile was also tender. It curved gently, winding through cities and villages, past temples and tombs. Children played on its banks. Fishermen cast nets from quiet boats. Priests floated candles on its surface during rituals at dusk. It was part of every moment, from birth to death, from prayer to festival. And in death, it was still there. Many tombs were built near its edges, the journey to the west, the land of the dead, beginning with a final crossing. Bodies wrapped in linen drifted gently toward their resting place, as if the river itself was escorting them home. The Nile, then, was not just a god. It was a guide, a witness to all things, and in its quiet flow, it whispered the same message, again and again. Life returns. Time flows, and the story goes on. Chapter 2. The first to wear the crown. In the hush of a time before temples rose and pyramids kissed the sky, there was only the river, the soil, and the struggle. Egypt, then, was not one land but two, the fertile ribbon of the north, fanning into a delta where reeds whispered to the sea, and the narrow southern spine, where the Nile ran between cliffs like a secret kept between gods. These two lands, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, were not friends. They were rivals, each ruled by its own chief, each blessed by its own traditions, gods, and soil. And yet, out of this ancient split, a single figure stepped into history's light, Narmer, or perhaps Menes. The names twist and tangle in time, like roots of a tree too deep to see clearly. Some say Narmer was the warrior, others claim Menes was the founder. But beneath these two names may lie one man, the same man who turned conflict into unity and chaos into rule. He has no voice in the records, no words we can read from his own hand, only fragments, a name carved beside a symbol of a catfish, a curious sign to us today, but one full of meaning in that early time. For Narmer means fierce catfish, a strange image perhaps, until we recall how the Nile's rivers teemed with life and danger. The catfish, strong and slippery, lived in both deep and shallow waters, could hide, could strike, could thrive where others would perish. In this way, perhaps the name was not strange at all. It was a sign of power, of cunning, of rule in a world where rule did not yet exist. Narmer's shadow falls long across the banks of early Egypt. We do not know his birth or the battles he fought, but we know what came after him. He is the one who wore two crowns, who led two lands, and who became, in silence and stone, the first pharaoh, the palette of power. Somewhere, deep in a tomb or a temple that no longer stands, an artist took a slab of siltstone and began to carve. Not words, not yet, but images, symbols, a story in pictures. That slab became what we now call the Narmer palette. It is small enough to hold, worn smooth by time, yet heavy with the weight of beginnings. No document in all of Egypt's long history reaches back further in time. And on it, in poised lines and proud symbols, we see the story unfold. On one side, Narmer stands tall, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He raises a mace in one hand, ready to strike down an enemy who kneels, bound and bare. Behind him walks a servant, holding his sandals, a quiet reminder that even in violence, ritual matters. Before him stands Horus, the falcon god of kingship, leading forth a captive land. In this moment carved from stone, Narmer is not just a man. He is power. He is divine will. He is Egypt's unification in action. Turn the palette over, and the story deepens. Now Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He walks among the bodies of the defeated, two mythic beasts with serpent necks twist and snarl, held apart by ropes, a sign, perhaps, of two lands brought into control. At the very base, a bull tramples a fallen enemy, crashes into the walls of a city. Again, this is not simple victory. It is authority. It is rule born not just from conquest, but from intention, from a vision of one land, one order, one pharaoh. The palette was not made for decoration. It was not meant for the people to see. It likely rested in a temple, brought out only for sacred rituals. Its message was not for the world, but for the gods. It said, "Look, I have made Egypt whole. I, Narmer, have shaped the land as it was meant to be. White crown, red crown." Before Narmer, the land wore two colors. White for Upper Egypt, a tall, cone-like crown that echoed the cliffs and cliffs of the south. Red for Lower Egypt, flat and curled, like the blossom of a reed, a nod to the spreading delta and the north. Each was ancient. Each held centuries of meaning and pride. But together they were something new. When Narmer placed both on his head, when the red curled over the white, forming what later would be called the skent, the double crown, he became not just a king. He became a symbol. This crown was more than gold or linen. It was a map, a message, promise. It said, "I rule not half but all. Not north, not south, but Egypt entire." It told those who saw it that war had passed and balance had come. That the king now held the strength of both lands in one body. That the gods had chosen a single shepherd for two herds. No other piece of clothing carried such power. Even in death, pharaohs were buried with their crowns beside them, carved in stone or painted in color. Over time, new crowns would emerge. The blue of war, the neem-striped headdress, but none held the same sacred weight as the double crown. It was not just worn, it was earned. To wear both was to walk a razor's edge. It meant balancing ancient rivalries, old gods, different tongues. It meant standing between storm and stillness, holding opposites in peace. And Narmer, in his silence, did just that. He became the still point in the turning of two lands. The first to wear both. The first to be both. From chaos, a lineage began. Narmer's crown was not just a sign of his reign. It was the beginning of a line. With him, the age of pharaohs was born. Not as kings, not as warriors alone, but as living gods. In this moment, quiet, distant, half-remembered, Egypt stepped into something new. A world where rule was not just strength, but sacred duty. Where the leader was not just above others, but between worlds, the bridge from sky to soil. Later records, carved hundreds of years after Narmer's time, placed him first in the royal lists. The king who came before time was measured, the one who began the first dynasty. And though so much remains unknown, how he ruled, how long he lived, where his bones may rest, one thing endures: his place at the start of a river that would flow for 3,000 years. With Narmer, the pharaoh became a keeper of Ma'at, the sacred order of balance and truth. His job was not just to tax or to fight, but to ensure that the sun rose and the floods came, that temples thrived and stars aligned. This was no mere mortal task. It required the king to be part man, part god. And it started with Narmer. His palette shows us the birth of power. His crown shows us the shape of rule. But his legacy lives in the idea that followed, that Egypt was not just a place, but a promise. A world held together by the will of one man made sacred. In time, others would rise, Djoser and Snefru, Khufu and Ramses. They would build monuments and carve names. But none would have stood without Narmer. His reign was short, perhaps, his image rare, but his role was everything. He lit the first torch in a line of eternal fire. And so, in the deep hush of early Egypt, as the river flowed and the stars turned, one man rose from the shadows. Narmer, the fierce catfish, the unifier, the first pharaoh, the first to wear the crown. Chapter 3: Architects of Forever. In the hush of a desert morning, where the Nile's waters slowly unwrapped the light of the rising sun, a city once stood half memory, half miracle. It was called Memphis, not the Memphis of modern maps, but the first of its name, born before the pyramids, before even time seemed certain. Its ancient name was Ineb-Hej, the white walls, white not from paint, but from the gleam of sun on limestone. It shimmered against the golden sands like a city dreamed into being by light itself. This was where the two Egypts met, upper and lower, bound together by the will of the first pharaohs. Here, the land found its balance. It was no accident that Memphis sat near the center, watching over both the red desert and the black silt of the Nile's banks. In this city, the gods were never far. Temples rose like breaths caught in stone, and statues peered down with eyes that never blinked. The temple of Ptah, the creator god, the one who spoke the world into being, stood at the heart of it all. Ptah was the god of craftsmen, the whisperer of blueprints, the dreamer of stone. And Memphis was his canvas. This city hummed with prayers turned into architecture. It was a place of beginnings, the birthplace of writing, of order, of kingship itself. The early rulers who stood on this sacred soil weren't just kings. They were keepers of Ma'at, balance, truth, and eternal rhythm. Each morning, when the light touched the white walls, it wasn't just another day. It was a promise, a renewal of the old bond between heaven and earth. The city echoed not with traffic or trade, but with sacred duties. Priests bathed statues, scribes copied the words of the gods, and builders shaped the skyline one chisel stroke at a time. Memphis was more than stone and sweat. It was a city that listened to the wind, to the river, and to the voices of eternity. Mastabas and the promise of return. Long before the pyramids cut the sky, there were tombs shaped like low houses, wide, flat, and strong. These were the mastabas. Their name meant bench, and they looked like quiet stone benches stretching across the desert. To the eye, they seemed simple, but beneath them lay the heart of a belief so deep, it would shape Egypt for thousands of years. The belief that death was not an end, but a door. Inside these mastabas, the dead were not laid to rest. They were prepared for return. The body, carefully wrapped, was sealed in chambers carved deep into the earth. Around it, servants carved statues and left offerings. Jars of food, amulets of power, and scrolls filled with spells. They were not just gifts. They were tools. A guidebook for the soul to find its way through the winding halls of the afterlife. The Egyptians did not fear death. They studied it, planned for it, and built toward it. These tombs stood at the edge of the western desert, where the sun disappeared each evening. To the ancient mind, that western horizon wasn't just a place. It was a symbol, the place where the day dies, and where the soul travels to await its next light. The west was sacred. It was the side of goodbyes and of return. Though humble compared to the pyramids that would follow, mastabas carried the same hope, that the soul could rise again. They were built not to impress, but to endure. Flat roofs defied wind. Thick walls kept out sand. The architecture spoke of silence and patience. It whispered that time, if you built for it, could become your ally. With each mastaba, the Egyptians refined their sacred art. They tested stone, studied structure, learned the weight of memory. And always, they built with purpose. To honor the dead, to hold on to legacy, and to tell the world that what was buried was not forgotten. The stone whisperer, Imhotep. In the quiet corridors of Egyptian memory, one name still echoes like a soft wind across stone. Imhotep. Not a king, not a god, not at first. He was a man, a mortal of flesh and thought who changed Egypt forever. He was a priest, a doctor, an astronomer. But most of all, he was an architect. And in a land ruled by divine kings, Imhotep became a kind of king himself of ideas. He served under Pharaoh Djoser during the Third Dynasty. At that time, the art of building in stone was still young. Most temples were of wood or brick. But Imhotep looked to the horizon and saw something more, something eternal. He believed stone could be shaped not just to shelter, but to speak. He listened to its weight, its grain, its promise. And it listened back. Imhotep did not simply draw plans. He drew prayers into shape. He saw geometry as sacred, angles as holy. To him, every block of limestone was a syllable in a sentence whispered to the gods. When he designed the first pyramid, he was not making a monument, he was making a message. One that could rise from earth to sky, carrying the soul of a king toward the stars. His genius was not only in form but in faith. Imhotep believed that architecture could connect the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. And the Egyptians believed in him, so much so that, after his death, they made him a god. The god of wisdom, of healing, of hidden knowledge. Shrines were built in his name. Pilgrims came to ask for cures, not just of the body, but of the spirit. To this day, the name Imhotep means he who comes in peace. But he also came with vision, with plans drawn in eternity. He did not just stack stones. He taught them to sing. The Step Pyramid. At Saqqara, just outside the city of Memphis, something still rises from the sands, a monument that changed everything. It is the Step Pyramid of Djoser, 6 giant terraces of limestone stacked like a stairway to the sky. It doesn't shine like the polished pyramids that came later. It doesn't need to. Its power is in its voice. This was the first pyramid. The first time Egypt dared to build so high, so boldly. The first time the earth reached for the stars. Before this, tombs had been low, flat, hidden. But Djoser wanted more, and Imhotep answered. He took the idea of the mastaba and stretched it upward. One layer, then another still. What emerged was not just a building, it was a path. A path for the king's soul to climb toward the heavens, one step at a time. This pyramid was a declaration that life continues, that kings matter, that memory must be made of stone. Its walls were not only for the dead. They held rooms for rituals, chapels for priests, corridors for the sacred drama of farewell. The complex was vast, surrounded by courtyards, false doors, and ceremonial spaces. It was not a tomb. It was a kingdom for the afterlife. And yet, despite its size, there is something quiet about the Step Pyramid. It does not shout. It waits. It stands still as centuries pass. Its shape speaks of clarity, clean lines, steady rhythm. It tells of a time when the impossible first became real, when humans looked to the gods and said, "We can build something that endures." That is what the Step Pyramid is, endurance. It is the memory of Memphis written in stone, the whisper of Imhotep echoing through time, the dream of Djoser rising still. Chapter 4. The Dream of Perfect Shape. The desert was wide and patient, and it waited for the dreams of kings. And in the 4th dynasty a dreamer came. His name was Sneferu, and he saw what others could not yet imagine, a monument not just for burial but for eternity. Before him, tombs had been hidden, mastabas tucked into the earth like cautious prayers. But Sneferu wanted something bolder, something that would lift the soul upward, not bury it down. He wanted a pyramid true, towering, and flawless. His reign would be long, and so too would his list of trials. For to reach the heavens with stone is no small thing. He wasn't born to silence. Sneferu ruled with energy and imagination. In art, in architecture, in the way his name was carved beside the gods, he seemed determined to leave more than just a tomb behind. He wanted a symbol, one that would not crack or crumble or fade with the seasons. Perfect shape, touched by the sky. And so began a journey that would take decades and move mountains. Not metaphorically, but literally. 3 pyramids would rise in his name. One collapsed, one bent, one stood like a whisper made of red fire. Sneferu, unlike other pharaohs, wasn't content with what already was. He believed Egypt could go further, that stone could reach higher, that a perfect triangle, that simplest of forms, could cradle the soul for all time. What followed wasn't just building. It was learning, risking, and above all, dreaming. The bent and the broken. The first attempt stood at Midam, just south of the older pyramid fields. Here, in the desert silence, Sneferu began with boldness. He ordered the builders to shape a step pyramid like the one Djoser had built before him, but then fill in the steps to create the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history. It was a leap forward in both vision and danger. They raised the core, added casing stones, pushed the walls upward, but something wasn't right. Cracks appeared, the ground trembled, and one day, after the king's gaze had turned elsewhere, the outer walls of Midam collapsed in a roar of dust and ruin. All that remains now is a strange, skeletal tower rising from a pile of debris, the ghost of ambition. But Sneferu did not give up. He moved north to Dashur. There, the builders began again. They were cautious at first, then bold. The base was wide, the angle sharp. For a time, the work seemed to go well. The walls climbed, but as the pyramid grew, something changed. The weight was too much, the angle too steep. To continue would be to risk another collapse. So they adjusted. Right in the middle of construction, the pyramid's sides were bent inward, forming a strange double slope. It was a compromise, but it worked. Today, we call it the bent pyramid. And despite its flaw, or maybe because of it, it stands like a reminder that even sacred things come from broken places. Its surface is still smooth in parts, the original casing stones clinging to its sides. And its angles, once seen as a mistake, are now seen as a milestone. Here, in this bend, Egypt learned how to build higher and how to learn from failure. The bent pyramid is quiet today. Winds pass through its ancient corridors. But the lessons carved into its angles still speak. Not every straight line is wise. And not every failure is a loss. Red pyramid rising. Sneferu had not yet found his perfect shape. But with each attempt, he was getting closer. The third pyramid, also at Dashur, would be the one that changed everything. The builders remembered what had gone wrong before. They softened the angle, not as steep, more stable. They chose limestone that blushed with red in the sun. And they worked slowly, carefully, block by block, letting the structure grow like a silent hymn. The red pyramid rose from the sand not with speed, but with steadiness. There was no sudden collapse, no bent angles, only balance. When it was finished, it stretched over 100 meters tall, wide, even, and proud. It was the first true pyramid in history, and it carried the weight of many lessons inside its red-lit stones. For Sneferu, it was a victory not of power, but of patience, and perhaps of love. For to build something this vast, this exact, this calm, there must have been more than ego behind it. There must have been belief. This pyramid was not decorated with colors or inscriptions. It didn't need to be. Its message was its shape, pure, symmetrical, unshaken. The Red Pyramid does not call attention to itself like the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by Sneferu's son. But in many ways, it is the more profound statement. A quiet one, complete one. When you stand at its base today, the stones hum with stillness. The corners meet in perfect right angles. The passage to the inner chamber drops low, as if asking you to bow before entering. And inside, The chambers echo with the breath of centuries. It is not loud, but it lasts. Sneferu, at last, had shaped a dream that did not break. And in doing so, he shaped Egypt. Lessons in stone. Each block of the Red Pyramid weighs tons. Each was placed by human hands. There were no machines, no computers, no blueprints. Only sand, stone, sky, and learning. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about Sneferu's story. Not that he built 3 pyramids, but that he treated each as a lesson. A classroom of stone. A test of what was possible. When Mitam fell, it was not buried or denied. It was studied. When Dashur bent, it was not hidden. It was completed. And when the Red Pyramid stood, it was not the result of chance. It was the harvest of knowledge. For Egypt was not only trying to honor the dead. It was learning how to endure. And with each layer of limestone, it was teaching itself how to hold on to light long after the body had faded. Sneferu's builders developed new techniques. Better core structures, refined angles, stable foundations. They learned how to align with the stars, how to carry massive stones across sand, how to ventilate the deep burial chambers. These weren't just feats of labor. They were acts of discovery. The pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a teacher, and the lessons lasted. Without Sneferu, there would be no Great Pyramid at Giza, no grand age of pyramid building, no silent geometry stretching across the western desert. His mistakes gave shape to his success, and his quiet red giant, rising from the sands of Dashur, became a template not just for pyramids, but for how a civilization builds its soul. In the soft wind that circles its base, you can still feel it, the dream of perfect shape. Not because it was flawless from the start, but because it was refined, reshaped, and remembered. Sneferu didn't just build in stone. He built in patience, in correction, in courage. And in the long hush of the desert, his story still rises, quietly, endlessly, toward the stars. Chapter 5, Monument to the Sky. In the heat of an Egyptian sun, before the noise of machines and the din of modern cities, there rose something that should not have been possible. A pyramid, not the first of its kind, but a shape that would never be equaled in scale or stillness. Khufu, the second king of Egypt's 4th dynasty, would be remembered not through words or sculpture, but through a monument so vast it seemed to touch the sky. The Great Pyramid of Giza, more than 2 million limestone blocks, each placed by human hands. No grand inscriptions decorate it. No vanity of carved walls or heroic panels. Just mass, just silence, just stone. It is easy to forget that each block had to be cut, shaped, transported, and lifted into place. And yet, in Khufu's time, this was not considered madness. It was order, cosmic order. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but a bridge between heaven and earth. His tomb would not just be a burial site. It would be the body of the sun's path, the ladder to eternity. And so, without modern cranes or pulleys, men began the work of building the tallest structure the world had ever seen, a mountain of human vision. It rose, block by block, in perfect geometry. Its sides faced the cardinal points with uncanny precision, as if it had been designed by stars instead of scribes. Khufu himself left behind no memoir, no long speech to explain why. All that remains is the shape, a triangle that rises from a square base, reaching upward as if in prayer. It does not speak. It stands. Giza, the sacred horizon. Long before tourists and cameras, the Giza Plateau was a desert of still air and golden sand. But under Khufu's reign, it became a sacred city of the dead. Not just the pharaoh's pyramid, but dozens of tombs, temples, and pathways. The Egyptians called this place Ake Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. It was not simply a graveyard. It was a world apart, where the afterlife took on form, and where every stone remembered the hands that placed it. Workers lived nearby in well-organized camps, not slaves as once believed, but skilled laborers fed, housed, and honored. They came from all corners of the Nile Valley, summoned for part of the year in service to something larger than themselves. The landscape shifted as canals were dug and roads laid. The desert was transformed, and out of it rose more than one pyramid. To the east and west of Khufu's structure, Smaller pyramids appeared for queens. Rows of mastaba tombs were built for nobles and officials, their flat roofs like pages in a book no longer read. And yet, it all revolved around that central point, the Great Pyramid towering over the plateau like a fixed star. The surrounding complex included mortuary temples, causeways, and pits for solar boats, vessels for the king's journey into the sky. This was a place not meant to be walked through, but to be passed into. Crossing, a silence wrapped in sun and shadow. Even today, Giza stirs something in those who walk its edges. The breeze is dry, the light is sharp, and the stones seem to glow softly, holding heat and memory alike. This was Egypt's sacred horizon, a liminal space between life and what comes after. And at its heart stood Khufu's silent mountain, watching, waiting, enduring. Mortar and myth. How do you move stone that weighs more than a car? How do you place it with enough precision that 4,000 years later, it still hasn't shifted? The answers lie not in magic, but in discipline, though to those who watched from afar, it must have looked like magic. The ancient Egyptians didn't leave behind blueprints or manuals, but they did leave hints. And among the most surprising is the diary of a man named Mirror. Discovered in 2013, Mirror's papyrus logs are the oldest known Egyptian papyri. They date to the very end of Khufu's reign, and they speak not of the king's thoughts, but of his stones. Mirror was a middle-ranking official, in charge of a team of workers who helped transport limestone from the quarries at Tura across the Nile. His notes describe days spent loading blocks onto boats, navigating canals, and delivering them to Giza. It was logistics, not legend, and it reveals a hidden infrastructure once believed lost to time. They used the Nile like a spine, branching off into man-made channels to reach the plateau. The stones were floated as close as possible before being hauled overland. Ramps may have been used straight, zigzagging, or spiraling. Each theory has merit. None are certain, but what is clear is the level of organization. No single genius directed it. Instead, thousands of hands followed one rhythm, one vision. They mixed gypsum mortar to fill the joints, softer than the limestone but strong enough to hold. They didn't have steel, but they had copper, sand, and time. They worked in teams, rotated seasonally, and left behind marks on stones. Names of crews, playful graffiti, signs of pride. This wasn't just labor, it was devotion. The pyramid is not hollow. It is solid except for a few small chambers. And yet, it still breathes myth. Some said the stones were poured like concrete. Others said giants placed them. But the truth is both simpler and more extraordinary. People did this. They planned, hauled, placed, and built for a king, for an afterlife, for eternity. Silence of the pharaoh. For all that he built, Khufu himself remains almost invisible. No grand statues, no long inscriptions boasting of conquests. Just a small ivory figure, no more than 3 inches tall, found in the ruins of a later temple. His name, Khnum Khufu, Khnum protects me, is carved into the base, and that is almost all we have. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing thousands of years later, painted him as a cruel ruler. But there is little in the archaeological record to prove this. In truth, Khufu is a mystery. His voice does not reach us. His likeness is barely preserved. Yet his pyramid still stands, as if to say, words fade, but presence endures. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are no golden halls or painted walls. The king's chamber is plain granite, austere and echoing. You walk through low passages and narrow shafts, each designed with care, but without decoration. The effect is not opulence. It is something deeper, a kind of reverence for stillness. Even the precision of the structure feels like a form of worship. The base is nearly level to within a fraction of an inch. The sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal points. The central shaft may have aligned with certain stars. Whether by design or by the guidance of ancient skywatchers, the pyramid seems to point not just upward, but outward to the heavens. Khufu did not speak through stone, but he spoke through silence. And in that silence, something lingers. His pyramid does not dazzle. It endures. It does not explain itself. It remains. The winds change. The cities rise and fall, but the pyramid, this mountain of intention, continues to hold its place beneath the sun. And perhaps that is the truest kind of legacy, not to be praised, not to be feared, but to be remembered. Not through noise, but through presence. Through a shape that meets the sky and never leaves. Chapter 6: Eyes of the Sphinx. In the silence that lingers between desert winds, a shadow takes form. It is not just the shadow of stone, but of a name, Khafre, son of the mighty Khufu, grandson of Sneferu, heir to dreams made of limestone and sun. His rise was not sudden, not filled with noise or grand declarations. It was measured, like the slow turning of the stars, inevitable and quiet. Egypt had already felt the weight of eternity under Khufu's rule, whose great pyramid scraped the sky and silenced all doubters. When Khafre stepped into the lineage, he did not attempt to outshine his father. Instead, he chose something different, a majesty that did not need to shout. His pyramid at Giza, the second in line, sits with a calm defiance, appearing taller from certain angles only because it rests on higher ground. Yet that illusion or intention tells a story. Khafre did not challenge the greatness that came before him. He embraced it, folded it into his own rule, and cast a reflection of power that felt like a whisper rather than a roar. His was an age of refinement. Where Khufu forced stone into submission, Khafre gave it grace. His monuments didn't demand attention, they drew it. Perhaps his greatest gift was not the pyramid itself, but the enigma that rests before it, a creature carved not to speak, but to watch. The Great Sphinx, part lion, part man, possibly Khafre's own likeness. It is a monument that feels more like a question than an answer. Why did he have it made? Was it to protect the tombs? Was it a guardian of the afterlife? Or was it simply an embodiment of divine stillness? Whatever the reason, it is this silent sentinel that outlives the stories, that sees without speaking, and waits without end. Khafre's rule is remembered less for war and conquest, and more for stillness and stone. He ruled not only over people, but over the horizon. And with that, he offered something rare in history, a vision of greatness that did not need to move, only to endure. His rise was not loud, but it was deep. And in the gaze of the Sphinx, that rise still lingers, unblinking, ancient, and utterly calm. The guardian of Giza, long before the winds buried its paws in layers of sand, long before tourists and cameras, and even before written words etched its story into scrolls, the Sphinx sat beneath the sky, gazing east toward the rising sun. A creature caught between worlds. Its body, low and feline, presses into the earth with the weight of time itself. Its face, human and serene, gazes forward with the patience of the gods. The Great Sphinx is not merely a statue. It is a riddle wrapped in silence, a guardian not just of tombs, but of mystery. The Sphinx faces the morning light. Every dawn, for thousands of years, the first rays of the sun have touched its weathered cheeks, like a daily ritual, as if the sky itself is whispering a greeting. And perhaps in that ritual there is meaning. In ancient Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra traveled across the sky by day and descended into the underworld by night. The Sphinx, looking east, may have been a divine watcher, ensuring the return of light, guarding the cycle of life and death, morning and night. But for all its strength, the Sphinx was not untouched by time. Over centuries, it was buried almost completely in sand, only its head visible, peeking from the dunes like a forgotten dream. It slept beneath the shifting grains, waiting. Empires rose and fell. Priests came and went. The Sphinx endured. And then, in moments scattered across history, people dug it free again. In the 1400s BCE, a young prince, later known as Pharaoh Thutmose IV, dreamed that the Sphinx spoke to him, promising kingship if he would unbury it. He obeyed. And so, the Sphinx was freed once more, not by armies, but by a dream. This pattern of burial and rebirth mirrors Egypt itself, a land of layers, where time does not erase, but hides. The Sphinx watches still. It does not speak. It does not act. But its silence is louder than any monument. It reminds us that true power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply looks on. Sunlight on limestone. In the golden heat of midday, it is easy to forget how these pyramids once looked. Today, they rise in muted tones, soft beige and pale dust. But once, long ago, they shone like stars fallen to the ground. Their outer casing stones, smooth and white, were made of polished Tura limestone, cut with perfect precision. When the sun struck their sides, the light danced. Not just reflected, it radiated. Imagine standing before them then. A wall of blazing white rising into the sky, clean as bone, bright as truth. These stones weren't meant for decay. They were meant for glory. They were meant to capture the sun and hold it, to echo the heavens and blind the eye. The ancient builders knew this. To them, the pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a beacon, a stairway for the soul, a mirror of the gods. The pyramid's form, four sides rising to a point, wasn't random. It followed a sacred geometry, meant to mimic the rays of the sun spreading outward. Light wasn't just beauty, it was a symbol of resurrection. And in this blinding brilliance, the dead king would rise again, not as a man, but as a god among stars. Time, of course, has worn the shine away. Most of the limestone was stripped centuries ago, repurposed for mosques, palaces, or cities. Only a few smooth stones remain near the base of Khafre's pyramid, like a whisper of what once was. But if you close your eyes and imagine the past with the patience of the desert, you can almost see it. Sunlight glinting off mirrored stone, shimmering across the plateau like a crown of light. And in that imagined glow, we remember the purpose. Not to build something eternal in darkness, but something eternal in radiance. The pyramids were not made for decay. They were made to dazzle, to awaken awe, to remind all who saw them that the divine lived not only in heaven, but here, carved in stone, kissed by light. The shadow of Menkaure. Toward the end of the grand age of pyramid building, a quieter king left his mark. Menkaure, son of Khafre, built the smallest of the three great pyramids at Giza. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in grace. His pyramid, just over 200 feet tall, was originally encased in granite along its base, deep red and finely carved. Unlike his predecessors, who built to overwhelm, Menkaure seemed to build with care. His monument does not shout. It breathes. There is a gentleness in his legacy. Statues of Menkaure show him standing beside goddesses, calm and youthful, his arms at his sides, his expression soft. In one of the most famous sculptures, he is flanked by Hathor and a regional goddess, not dominating them but walking with them. This is not the image of a conqueror. It is the image of a man at peace with power. Menkaure's pyramid marked the end of an era. After him, no pharaoh would build on this scale again. Egypt's power would shift, its resources would stretch, and slowly, the obsession with massive tombs would give way to other forms of greatness. His pyramid is like a closing sigh, the final breath of a dream that once touched the sky. Even today, when the sun sets over Giza, it casts long shadows across the stones. The Great Pyramid stands tallest. Khafre's pyramid still gleams with a trace of its original coating. But it is Menkaure's pyramid, small and serene, that often fades first into the dusk. And in that fading, there is a kind of poetry, a quiet reminder that not all legacies need to be vast to be lasting. His was a reign of dignity, of balance, of quiet refinement. And as the age of monument faded into memory, Menkaure stood at the threshold, not resisting change, but accepting it with grace. In the shadow of his pyramid, time slows, and for a moment even the winds seem to pause, not to mourn an ending, but to honor a gentle farewell. Chapter 7. When the Gods Wept. Pepi II came to the throne as a boy, so young that legend says he could barely walk when he was crowned king. And yet, his reign would become one of the longest in all of recorded history. For over 90 years, he sat upon the throne of Egypt, as the world around him began to drift, slowly, into something unfamiliar. At first, it was the usual rhythm. Pharaoh gave orders and the nation responded. Temples were built, taxes collected, priests praised the gods, and the Nile rose and fell like breath. But decades passed, and with them, something essential began to fade. A kind of energy, the unity that once pulsed from the heart of Memphis, began to scatter. It was not a sudden collapse. It was slower than memory, quieter than a whisper. Like a thread pulled gently from the hem of a garment, power slipped away. The old officials, those who had served under mighty kings like Jedkare or Teti, began to die. Their sons took their place, and then their sons after them, but with each generation, the connection to the central throne grew thinner. Local governors, once humble servants of the pharaoh, began to act more like kings in their own right. They built tombs larger than their predecessors. They wrote their names in bold in places once reserved for royalty. The divine status of the pharaoh, once unquestioned, began to feel distant, as if the gods themselves had turned their faces away. And Pepi II, old, weary, outliving sons and grandsons, became a shadow of his former self. His rule had once stretched across deserts and deltas, but now it struggled to reach the edges of its own borders. The pyramids still stood, proud and clean in the sun, but the world behind them had begun to shift. The glory of the old kingdom was no longer rising. It was unraveling, slowly, under the weight of time and silence, famine and fracture. Then came the river's betrayal. The Nile, Egypt's eternal lifeline, began to falter. Year after year, the floodwaters came too low or too late. The black silt, that rich, life-giving soil, no longer coated the fields as it once had. Crops failed, granaries emptied, and the people, once confident in the gods' favor, began to starve. In the countryside, families buried their dead with no offerings, no songs, no hope. Children cried for bread that did not exist. Mothers watched the skies for signs of rain, but the clouds passed by, indifferent. The priests offered prayers, but even the temples felt hollow. It was as though the balance of the world, the great order known as Ma'at, had been disturbed, and chaos, Isfit, had crept in. With famine came fear, and with fear came fracture. The nomarchs, governors of provinces, no longer waited for the word of the pharaoh. They raised their own armies. They built their own walls. They taxed their own people. Egypt, once unified by divine rule and the pulse of the Nile, now broke into smaller pieces, each ruled by a different voice, each fighting to survive. Kingship, once sacred, became a memory. Some still called themselves pharaoh, but their words did not echo beyond their own borders. The country was no longer one Egypt. It was many Egypts, divided by hunger, suspicion, and silence. What had been eternal began to feel fragile. What had seemed divine now felt deeply, painfully human. Voices from tombs. From the dust and darkness of this collapse, some voices remain. They come not from palaces or great halls, but from tombs, stone chambers where memory does not fade. Inini, a noble of Upper Egypt, left behind lines that echo with grief. He spoke not of riches, but of fear. The entire land was in great affliction. Evil fell on the earth. There was no more bread. Then came Anktifi, a governor from Hierakonpolis, a man who wrote not just for himself but for the future. On the walls of his tomb, he carved the story of a broken world. He claimed to have fed the hungry, to have calmed the chaos around him. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, meat to the poor. I did not allow a single person to die of hunger in my city. Whether these words were truth or pride, they paint a picture of a world where hunger defined life and leadership was measured in loaves. And then there was Apur, a man of letters, perhaps a priest or a scribe, whose words survive in a single scroll. His voice is a cry, a lament of everything lost. The river is blood, he wrote. The nobles are in lamentation. The poor are full of joy. His lines describe a world turned upside down. Slaves now rule. The law is broken. The gods are silent. Gone is the grain. Perished are the makers of bread, he cries. These were not the grand hymns of victory sung in golden halls. These were the quiet, desperate songs carved in stone and scratched onto papyrus. The record of people who had seen Egypt fall, who had lived through the unraveling, and who tried, in their own way, to leave a warning. A kingdom of dust. And so, The old kingdom faded, not with a grand final battle, not with the roar of invading armies, but with silence, with dust, with the slow crumbling of certainty. The pyramids remained, unmoved by the hunger around them. They stood like ghosts of a greater time, proud, still empty. The kings who built them had long since turned to bone, and the line of pharaohs became broken and unclear. Egypt was no longer ruled from one throne. Power shifted from place to place. Some cities rose, others fell. Some temples still burned incense to the gods, while others were left to the sand. The grand projects of unity, the building of pyramids, the carving of stone from the quarries of Tura, came to a stop. There was no gold for the tombs, no labor for the monuments. Even the gods, once clothed in fine linen and fed with daily offerings, now sat in quiet shrines, their priests scattered or starving. This was the first intermediate period, a name we give now with the benefit of distance. But to those who lived through it, it had no name. It was simply the time when everything they knew began to fall apart. When the old stories no longer matched the world around them. When the gods wept and no one knew why. Yet even in this dust, something waited. In the cracks of the broken kingdom, seeds were still buried, seeds of strength, of memory, of hope. The pyramids, though still stood. The Nile, though faltering, still flowed. And the people, those who endured famine, who carved words into tomb walls, who kept the old songs alive in whispers, they would not vanish. The light had dimmed, but not gone out. The gods had wept, but they had not left. Egypt, though broken, still breathed. Chapter 8: The Return of the South. From the highlands of Thebes, where sandstone cliffs watched over the curve of the Nile, a new rhythm stirred. The land had known silence for too long, a quiet that wasn't peace, but pause. Egypt had splintered. The north held its own rulers, the delta drifting further from the old center. For more than 100 years, kings had come and gone, none able to mend what had broken after the fall of the old kingdom. But in the south, where the desert heat pressed against temple walls and prayers still rose with the morning sun, a single line of kings remained, steady, patient, waiting. They called themselves the 11th dynasty, and in time, one among them would rise higher than the rest. His name was Mentuhotep. Montu is satisfied, a name given to him in honor of the Theban war god, and in his heart there was fire. Mentuhotep was not born into a golden throne. He inherited a kingdom made of fragments, a patch of land around Thebes, with little more than dust and devotion to hold it. But he had a vision. He saw not a divided land, but a single Egypt, stretching from the shores of the delta to the sands of Nubia. And unlike those who ruled before him, he did not rely only on words. He read the mood of the land. He understood the bitterness of the north, the fear of losing power, and the pride that came from independence. And he knew that unity would not be handed to him. He would have to march for it. His campaign began not with celebration, but with quiet determination. Soldiers were gathered, temples were blessed, and banners bearing the falcon of Horus were raised above Theban walls. The gods were watching, and Mentuhotep moved north. With each step, the desert echoed. Town by town, the king reclaimed the land. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. He struck swiftly, like the god Montu himself, before resistance could spread. By the time the Delta realized the danger, it was already too late. The South had begun to rise, not in rebellion, but in restoration. The war for unity. The North did not fall quietly. Her cities had tasted freedom. For generations, they had lived without the voice of a single pharaoh. They had grown used to self-rule, to choosing their own paths, praying to their own gods, and shaping their own tombs. So when the armies of Mentuhotep reached their borders, the ground shook with more than just footsteps. It shook with fear, with defiance, with fire. Some towns surrendered, others stood their ground. And so war came to the two lands once more. It was not a war of empires, nor one of conquest for gold. It was a war of memory, of who Egypt once was, and who it could be again. Mentuhotep's soldiers moved like the Nile in flood season, relentless, impossible to stop. But the resistance was fierce. Fortresses burned. Villages fell into ruin. At times, it seemed the dream would drown in blood. But the king pressed on. He had not come this far to fail. His sword was his word. His victories, his message. Years passed. Battles blurred into one another. But slowly, steadily, the tide shifted. The north began to crack. Old loyalties faltered. Rulers fell. The dream of a united Egypt, a dream carved into every temple wall since the dawn of kings, began to rise again like the sun over the eastern hills. Mentuhotep had not just won battles. He had restored belief, and with belief came peace. At last, the two lands were one. For the first time in centuries, Upper and Lower Egypt bowed to a single ruler. And Mentuhotep, the king who came from the cliffs of Thebes, stood as the first true pharaoh of a new age. He took a new title, Uniters of the Two Lands. It was more than a name. It was a promise. Gods of Thebes. With the north subdued and the lands unified, the king turned inward, toward the spirit of Egypt. For in the heart of every dynasty lies the gods. They were not just myths. They were power, protection, and purpose. And in Thebes, a new god had begun to whisper in the wind. His name was Ammonius. Before Mentuhotep, Ammonius had been a quiet deity, a local god of air, known mostly in Thebes alone. But as Thebes rose, so did he. The people began to see their own story in him, hidden, rising, and full of unseen strength. Ammonius' name meant the Hidden One, and that mystery only made him more powerful. In the new temples of Thebes, incense curled toward his altar. Priests spoke his name with reverence. And in time, he became more than a god of wind. He became a god of kings. Mentuhotep embraced Ammonius fully, not just as a protector, but as a symbol. Ammonius represented the invisible force behind the throne, the divine hand guiding unity, strength, and rebirth. His temples were carved with care. His statues stood tall beneath the stars. And beside him, other gods adapted too. Montu, the war god, remained close to the king's heart, a reminder of the battles that forged peace. But now, Ammonius shared that place. And slowly, the center of spiritual life began to shift south. As Thebes grew into Egypt's spiritual capital, the old gods of Memphis and Heliopolis, like Ptah and Ra, did not fade. Instead, they evolved. In time, Ammonius would be merged with Ra to form Ammonius Ra, Lord of all the heavens. But it began here, in the breath of Theban priests, in the rhythm of Mentuhotep's worship, in the stones of temples that still rise today. The gods, like the people, were learning how to be whole again. Peace in stone again. Victory brings silence, but silence needs shelter. And so, with his kingdom united and his gods honored, Mentuhotep turned to eternity. In the cliffs west of Thebes, where the sun sets and the dead are laid to rest, he began the greatest work of his life, his tomb. Not a pyramid in the north like the kings of old, but something new, something between earth and sky. At Deir el-Bahri, a terrace was carved from the rock. Layer upon layer, it rose like the steps of a heavenly stair. The cliffs themselves became part of the tomb, not just walls but guardians. Here, in this sacred valley, Mentuhotep would sleep, not alone but with a message. His tomb was not just a place to bury the body. It was a monument to rebirth. Painted walls told of his triumphs. Statues lined the paths, staring toward the horizon. And every stone whispered the same thought, that peace, once shattered, could be built again. Not with gold, but with patience. Not with fear, but with faith. Deir el-Bahri would inspire generations. It stood as the first great tomb of the Middle Kingdom, a shift from the Old Kingdom's pyramids to something more woven with the land itself. Later, others would build here too, including the great Queen Hatshepsut. But Mentuhotep had come first. He had turned cliffs into scripture. And when his time came, the king lay within those hills, cradled by the earth he had restored. Egypt had been broken, but he had made her whole. With sword and stone, with prayer and power, he had walked the path of legends. The return of the South was more than a march. It was a return to meaning. And so, in the hush of the desert night, with stars like ancient eyes above, Mentuhotep still rests, not just as a king, but as a reminder that what is lost can be found, that what is divided can be healed, and that even in dust, greatness can rise again. Chapter 9: The Empire and the Sun. There are times in history when a civilization seems to catch its breath. After struggle, after collapse, after storms of war and famine, there comes a stillness, not of silence, but of order. For ancient Egypt, that moment was the Middle Kingdom. Stretching roughly from 2055 to 1650 BCE, it was a time of rebuilding, not from ashes, but from the memory of greatness. This era followed the disorder of the First Intermediate Period, when competing rulers had pulled Egypt apart like strands of linen unraveling at the seams. Now, under new leaders from Thebes, especially the founder Mentuhotep II, unity was slowly stitched back together. But it was more than political repair. The Middle Kingdom glowed with a different kind of light, steady, deliberate, thoughtful. These were not just warrior kings. They were stewards, pharaohs who ruled not only with the scepter but also with scroll and scale. A new kind of justice was written into law, more concerned with fairness than fear. Temples were built, yes, but so were irrigation systems, canals, granaries, signs that this kingdom wanted to last. This period is often called Egypt's classical age, and for good reason. It was the age of elegant literature, clear legal codes, and stable governance. It was not as flashy as the Old Kingdom's pyramid grandeur, nor as ambitious as the later empires, but it was balanced, almost humble. The Middle Kingdom did not need to shout to be heard. It simply lived well. Pharaohs such as Senusret I and Amenemhat III governed like craftsmen, careful, precise, aware of the weight of each decision. Trade returned to distant lands. Mines opened, artisans thrived, and in the hearts of their people, pharaohs were still divine but also human. They were leaders who walked through cities, not just who gazed down from stone. This balance, this golden middle path, is what made the Middle Kingdom a jewel in Egypt's long crown. Senusret and the walls of the ruler. One of the brightest stars in this golden sky was Senusret III, a pharaoh who ruled not only with strength but with vision. His face, captured in statues, shows a deep gaze, tired yet firm, as if carrying the weight of an entire nation on his brow. This was no accident. The artists of the Middle Kingdom chose to depict pharaohs with signs of aging, with furrowed brows and serious mouths. These were not the eternally young gods of old. These were burdened leaders shaped by responsibility. Senusret III knew that peace, no matter how golden, is always temporary unless protected. The southern borders of Egypt, along the wild region of Nubia, were vulnerable. Rivers curved, rocks jutted, and foreign tribes, the Nubians, sometimes crossed the boundaries, threatening Egypt's grip on trade and safety. So Senusret acted. He built a line of mighty forts, known as the Walls of the Ruler. These were not simple outposts. They were complex, layered systems of defense and control, rising beside the Nile like stone sentinels. Soldiers lived inside them. Traders were inspected. Messages were sent swiftly up and down the river. Egypt no longer turned its back on its edges. It faced outward, watchful and prepared. But this outward gaze was not only for war. Senusret also opened trade routes, sent expeditions south, and built alliances. He understood that power is not just about walls, it is about bridges too. And in this careful balance, stone and scroll, spear and treaty, Senusret crafted an Egypt that was not only safer but smarter. Under his rule, the pharaoh became something new, not just a divine figure, but a commander of strategy, a planner of state. The country followed his lead, building with intention. Cities thrived. Temples became centers of both worship and administration. And the Nile, Egypt's eternal thread, carried not only water but order, moving from fortress to farm, from palace to people. Art of the everyday. While the pyramids of the Old Kingdom reached for the heavens, the Middle Kingdom looked inward, toward the lives of its people. And in this turn inward, something beautiful emerged, art that told quieter stories. Gone were the massive tombs that shouted of power. In their place came smaller, detailed models carved in wood, Tiny boats with painted oarsmen, kitchens with kneeling bakers, farms with rows of cattle and workers bent under the sun. These were not symbols. These were slices of real life frozen in time, scenes of the world as it was lived, not just as it was ruled. Scribes, once mere servants of bureaucracy, became artists in their own right. On sheets of papyrus, they wrote poems, proverbs, and tales. One famous story, the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, told of a man who meets a magical serpent on a distant island. Another, the eloquent peasant, speaks of a poor man who uses words like weapons, pleading for justice. These were not myths of gods. These were stories of people, flawed, brave, clever, and they taught values through simplicity. Even in religion, the focus shifted. The great god Osiris, once a shadowy figure, rose to new prominence as the judge of the afterlife. He was not just for kings. In the Middle Kingdom, common people began to believe that they, too, could reach paradise if they lived rightly. Artisans sculpted statues not only of pharaohs but of scribes, servants, and priests. Jewelry became more personal. Hymns were sung not just in praise of divine rulers, but in thanks for daily bread, for sunrise, for the hush of evening. In many ways, the Middle Kingdom was a mirror. It reflected not only the glory of its kings, but the quiet beauty of ordinary life. It told Egypt's story not as thunder, but as rainfall, steady, soft, nourishing. When the crown grows heavy. But golden ages, like the Nile's floods, do not last forever. Slowly, cracks began to appear. Not loud, not sudden, but deep. The kingdom had grown wide, perhaps too wide. Ruling from Thebes, the pharaohs stretched their influence across vast distances, south into Nubia, north into the delta, east into the deserts. And with every outpost, every new road, came a question. Can one man, one crown, truly hold it all? The answer, whispered by time, was no. Local governors, known as nomarchs, began to act more independently. They built up their own wealth, their own armies. The central government, once strong and swift, became sluggish. Communication slowed. Law became uneven. And where unity weakens, ambition grows. Foreigners, too, watched with interest. From the northeast came the Hyksos, a people whose name would later echo through Egypt's darkest fears. At first, they arrived peacefully, settling in the delta. But over time, they grew stronger. They brought new weapons, horses, chariots, tools Egypt had not yet mastered. Inside the kingdom, fear grew quietly. The confidence of the Middle Kingdom, its balanced laws, its calm order began to shake. It was not a fall with a bang. It was a fading, a dimming of the great lamp that had burned so steadily for centuries. And the pharaohs themselves, once shown as wise and weathered rulers, began to look tired in their statues. The burden of holding Egypt together, of guarding its borders, feeding its people, pleasing its gods, it showed in the stone. The crown had grown heavy. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt had not collapsed. But it had softened. It had opened doors, but also exposed its walls. And in this quiet vulnerability, history was preparing its next chapter, one of foreign rule, rebellion, and fire. But that story was still to come. For now, the Middle Kingdom stood in dusk, its golden light still warm, but beginning to fade into the long shadow of what would follow. Chapter 10, Storms from the North. In the soft hush of the Nile Delta, where papyrus once danced in the breeze and the reeds whispered stories of Horus and Ra, something unfamiliar arrived, something that did not speak the old tongue or kneel before the old gods. The sky seemed to darken as chariots, strange, thundering chariots with spoked wheels and swift horses, cut through the quiet. From the northeast, across the vulnerable borders of Egypt's delta, came the Hyksos, foreign rulers from distant lands, bringing with them tools of war the Egyptians had never seen before. They bore curved bows that reached farther than any Egyptian weapon. They rode high in their chariots, fast and deadly, and where they passed, fear bloomed like fire across the land. The cities of the north fell not with great battles, but with the slow ache of confusion. Who were these people? Some say they came not first as conquerors, but as traders, settlers, until they saw that Egypt had grown soft. A string of weak kings had ruled from the throne at Ichtoi, distracted by court rituals and golden tombs. The walls were not guarded. The armies had grown ceremonial, and into that silence rode a storm. The Hyksos took Avaris first in the eastern delta. From there, they spread like ink across the scroll of Lower Egypt. They brought new words into the language of the land, Semitic tongues, sharp and strange. They offered new gods, new customs, new hierarchies. They crowned themselves pharaohs, as if the title could be taken like loot from a tomb. And in the temples of the north, priests bowed before names not written in hieroglyphs. The sacred lines of Ma'at, the balance, the order had cracked. But not all was lost. South of the Hyksos-held delta, the heart of Egypt beat on. In Thebes, the blood of the old kings still flowed, quiet and waiting. Thebes stands silent. The city of Thebes lay like a sleeper with open eyes. It did not fall. It did not fight. It listened. Along the banks of the Nile, far to the south, the old traditions still held. The temples stood tall, their pillars casting long shadows across the sand. The gods were still honored in chants that echoed through the sacred halls, and the names of the true pharaohs were still spoken with care. Here, the bloodline had not forgotten itself. But what could they do? Their armies were few, their weapons old. The land was divided not just by geography but by fear. The Hyksos ruled the north, and they were strong. Their horses, their bows, their chariots. These were things Egypt had never needed before. War had not been Egypt's way. Egypt had been a land of building, of planting, of praising the sun. It had not learned to fight like this. So Thebes waited. Its rulers, holding titles in name only, walked beneath the stars and watched the northern skies for signs of change. The Nile still rose and fell, and the farmers still sowed their fields. But beneath the surface, something stirred. The silence of Thebes was not weakness, it was preparation. The time of watching would end. One day the south would rise. But first it would remember who it was. In the tombs of their ancestors, the kings of Thebes walked in thought. They spoke to the walls, to the gods, to the memory of Egypt itself. And the silence gave birth to resolve. Rise of the warrior kings. It began with Sekenenra. He was not a pharaoh in the full sense. Not in wealth, not in might, but in heart he bore the fire of the old gods. His name meant he who strikes like Ra, and he would come to live up to it. The records of his reign are few, and his end is known more by the shape of his skull than the stroke of his pen. But it is in that wound, a great fracture left by an axe or mace, that we see his defiance. He had gone to war, and he had died in it. Sekenenra had challenged the Hyksos. He had refused their messengers, their dominance, their insults. There is an old tale, perhaps true, perhaps imagined, that the Hyksos king sent word to Thebes, demanding the quieting of noisy hippos in a sacred lake, as if to mock the southern court. It was a challenge dressed as a jest, and Sekenenra did not laugh. After him came Kamos, young and bold. He struck northward, raiding Hyksos cities with the fury of a desert storm. He died too before the battle was done, but he carved the path, and down that path came Amos. Amos, son of the storm. He had grown up in the shadow of fallen kings, taught by war, sharpened by loss. When he came to power, he did not wait. He trained his men in chariot warfare. He gathered the tools of the enemy and learned to wield them with Egyptian strength. He was pharaoh not just in name but in action. Under him, Thebes no longer watched. It moved. His campaigns were swift and steady. City by city, he reclaimed what had been taken. Walls were torn down. Enemy shrines were broken. And slowly, the delta began to speak Egyptian again. The expulsion and the flame. The final push came like thunder. Avaris, the heart of Hyksos rule, fell not in a single strike but in waves of siege and resistance. The battle was bitter. The streets rang with cries not heard since Egypt had first risen from the dust. But Amos did not stop. He fought not only for land, but for memory, for the soul of Egypt. And then they were gone. The Hyksos, their gods, their horses, their foreign crowns, expelled, driven beyond the borders into the lands of Canaan, where they would vanish into the threads of time. Egypt was whole again, but it was not the same. The fire of war had changed it. Ahmose stood not only as a victor but as the first pharaoh of a new era. From his sword was born the new kingdom, an empire that would stretch farther than Egypt had ever dared before. The land that had once only built now marched. The temples now echoed not just with hymns, but with stories of conquests, of distant lands, of glory carved in stone. The wounds of invasion were not forgotten. They became lessons, etched into the mind of Egypt. Never again would it be caught unguarded. From this flame it rose not as a passive land of the Nile, but as a force. And so the story of the pharaohs turned its page. With blood and dust, with the silence of Thebes broken by the voice of war, Egypt stepped into an age of power. The gods watched, the sun rose, and in the heart of every stone, every scroll, every whisper of the wind across the desert, the memory of those storms from the north lived on, a warning and a promise. Chapter 11. The Age of Gold and Glory. The wind shifted across the Nile, and with it, the spirit of a nation stirred from its long slumber. Egypt had been bruised by invasion, humbled by the rule of the Hyksos, who had brought with them foreign gods, foreign chariots, and the bitter taste of occupation. But now the intruders were gone, driven out by the kings of Thebes, a southern dynasty hardened by exile and sharpened by vision. The new kingdom had begun, and with it a new Egypt emerged, not as a recluse but as a conqueror. In the golden light of dawn, the Theban kings looked beyond their borders. No longer content to simply defend their valleys and temples, they reached for something greater. For centuries, Egypt had been a land looking inward, its heart beating steadily along the river's edge. But now, the heartbeat grew louder, stronger, and it marched to the sound of war drums. Egypt would never again be only a land of pyramids and prayers. It would become an empire. It began with Ahmose I, the pharaoh who expelled the Hyksos. He was more than a warrior, he was the spark of a rebirth. In his wake came kings who wore crowns not just for the land of the Nile but for lands beyond Syria, Canaan, Nubia. Egypt's shadow stretched farther than ever before, and the world began to take notice. In tombs carved deep in the cliffs and on walls painted with mineral reds and deep lapis blues, scribes recorded the rise of a new kind of pharaoh, one who ruled not just with divine favor but with strategy, with steel, and with a hunger for legacy. The new kingdom was bold, it was radiant, and it was restless. Gold flowed from Nubia like a river of its own, and with it came the wealth to build, not just for function but for awe. Thebes became a city of splendor, its temples gleaming in the sun, its palaces echoing with hymns to gods old and new. Egypt was no longer healing, it was rising. Thutmose and the sword of the south. Of all the pharaohs who carried Egypt's ambitions upon their shoulders, none would carve their name more sharply into the memory of the ancient world than Thutmose III. He was not born into war, he was shaped by it. At first, too young to rule alone, he stood in the shadow of his powerful stepmother, Hatshepsut, who ruled as king in her own right. But when the time came and the crown was his alone, he took Egypt's armies and turned them into the sharpest blade the ancient world had ever seen. They called him the Napoleon of Egypt, though he came thousands of years before that name had meaning. He led no fewer than 17 campaigns beyond Egypt's borders, across deserts and rivers, through mountain passes and into the hearts of cities that had never seen the Nile. With chariots roaring and banners high, his soldiers marched into the Levant and to the edges of Mesopotamia. At the Battle of Megiddo, he showed the full weight of Egypt's new ambition. The city, fortified and defiant, stood as a gate to the northern lands. Thutmose, clever and patient, led his army through a narrow pass, risking ambush. But when his forces emerged, they struck like the desert wind, sudden, swift, and without mercy. The city fell, and with it, dozens of regional kings bowed in tribute. Thutmose was not just a tactician, he was a builder of empire. He demanded hostages from noble families, brought them to Egypt, educated them in the ways of the Nile, and returned them home loyal. His reach was not just through battle but through culture, diplomacy, and fear. His inscriptions spoke of conquests not in screams but in carved certainty. "I brought back tribute from every land," he wrote, and the records agree. Gold, lapis, cedarwood, ivory, even exotic animals. The wealth of the world poured into Egypt like the floodwaters of the Nile. In the south, Nubia became more than a neighbor. It became a province, managed and taxed, feeding Egypt with its deep resources. The Sword of the South, as Thutmose was called, did not simply fight. He reshaped the map. And yet, in the heart of all this power, his legacy was written not in blood, but in stone. Temples and triumphs. With victory came splendor. And with splendor came temples, vast, holy, magnificent structures that rose from the earth like mountains of meaning. But these were not just places for prayer. In the age of empire, temples were instruments of power, painted with victory and designed to make gods of men. Nowhere was this clearer than at Karnak. What began as a simple shrine grew into a forest of stone. Tall columns reaching like trees into the sky, walls covered in hieroglyphs that told stories of conquest, loyalty, and divine right. Each pharaoh who added to Karnak did so not only for the gods, but for himself. Each gate, each pylon, each avenue of ram-headed sphinxes was a declaration. Egypt rules. Luxor, too, stood as a testament to majesty. Facing the river, its columns caught the light of sunset in warm hues. This was the southern mirror to Karnak's might, and the two were joined by a ceremonial road. During festivals, priests and crowds would walk this path, carrying statues of the gods in golden boats, singing hymns that echoed off the sandstone. Temples were where stone met story. Inside, reliefs showed the pharaoh smiting enemies, offering gifts to deities, and receiving the blessings of the divine. It did not matter if every battle had truly gone that way. What mattered was the message, that Egypt was eternal, her pharaoh chosen, her gods pleased. The building of temples employed thousands. Architects, stonemasons, artists, farmers turned workers during the Nile's flood. The work was slow, patient, and reverent. Some projects took decades, others lifetimes, but no one doubted their purpose. To enter a temple was to walk into a world between heaven and earth, a place where the mortal touched the immortal. In the shadows of those colonnades, one could feel the ambition of an empire not just to conquer the world, but to define it. In art, in stone, in permanence, the temples were not quiet places. They were alive, with chant, with incense, with the memory of victory. Pharaohs as living gods. Once, long ago, the pharaoh had been a shepherd, a servant of the people, a voice between earth and sky. But in the age of gold and glory, something changed. The crown became more than a symbol, it became a halo. The pharaoh was no longer just the chosen of the gods. He became one. It did not happen all at once. Slowly, over time, the language shifted. In carvings, the pharaoh was shown with divine features. In ceremonies, he was treated not just with honor, but with worship. Statues portrayed him in the likeness of Horus, the falcon god, or Ra, the sun. This was not mere pride. It was politics. In a land where the king ruled faraway cities and distant peoples, his presence had to be more than physical. It had to be spiritual. His voice needed to reach across deserts. His image had to command obedience in places where he would never walk. To declare the pharaoh divine was to unify the empire with belief. Soldiers did not just fight for a ruler. They fought for a god. Farmers did not just pay taxes. They offered tribute to the living son of the sun. This divinity was woven into every part of life. Festivals honored the pharaoh as both man and deity. Poems praised his wisdom as greater than any mortal's. Even his tomb was not simply a resting place. It was a portal to eternity, a guarantee of the world's continued balance. For the people, it was a comfort and a mystery. To see their ruler ride in procession, painted in sacred colors, flanked by fanbearers and priests. It was a reminder that they lived in a special time, in a golden age. And for the pharaoh himself, it was a weight like no other. To be worshipped is to be watched. To be divine is to never be allowed to fail. But they embraced it. Each king who followed Thutmose stepped deeper into this divine identity. Amenhotep, Seti, and Ramses, they spoke as gods, ruled as gods, built as gods. And in doing so, they shaped an empire not just with armies, but with myth, with memory, with the belief that to be Egyptian was to belong to something eternal. In this age, Egypt was more than a nation. It was a flame, burning bright and steady against the winds of time. And its kings, its living gods, stood at the center of that fire. Chapter 12. The Woman Who Wore the Beard. In the golden hush of dawn, the Nile glowed like a ribbon of firelight, winding through the bones of an ancient world. Along its banks, the palms swayed gently, whispering old secrets. Egypt had known many rulers, most of them men, sun-kissed kings with falcon crowns and golden sandals. But once, in a moment that defied centuries of tradition, a woman climbed the steps of power. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she would wear the beard of kings not in disguise, but in defiance. She was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, born into the rich silk of royalty. As a princess, she learned the language of power, not just how to smile in temples, but how to govern with grace. When her father died, she first served as queen, the royal wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. But Egypt's fate shifted again when he too passed on, leaving behind a young heir too small to rule alone. And so, the caretaking began. Hatshepsut, the regent, watching over the boy king Thutmose III. But something grew in her during those quiet years, a calling louder than custom. She did not wait for the child to grow into the crook and flail. Instead, she placed the crown upon her own brow. She wrapped herself in the regalia of the two lands. And most boldly of all, she wore the ceremonial false beard, the symbol of pharaohs, not to hide her womanhood, but to fulfill a role larger than gender. She became king in name and image, not as a placeholder, but as ruler in her own right. Her rise was not marked by battles or uprisings. It was quiet, careful, and steeped in divine story. She claimed the god Ammonius had chosen her. She called herself his daughter. Temples began to carve her image as both woman and king, soft-featured but firm-jawed, clothed in male power, yet touched by feminine grace. Egypt did not roar in protest. It adjusted slowly to her reign. And in her calm hands, the land flourished like papyrus in flood season. The temple at Deir el-Bahri, across the river from Thebes, where the cliffs rose like sleeping giants from the desert floor, Hatshepsut built her voice in stone. There, carved into the sacred earth beneath the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, rose a temple like no other, the mortuary temple of a queen who ruled like a king. It did not climb the sky like the pyramids of old. It did not scream of might or conquest. Instead, it whispered. 3 broad terraces, stacked like silence, reached out from the mountain. Each was edged by colonnades, rows of graceful pillars that caught the changing light like harp strings catching breeze. Ramps, gentle and slow, led the visitor upward, not in triumph, but in awe. Unlike the temples built for gods of thunder or kings of war, this one sang with balance. It married the mountain, not fought it. The limestone, pale and cool, mirrored the cliffs behind it. Birds nested in its corners. The sun stroked its steps like an old friend. Inside, its walls bloomed with colors still breathing thousands of years later. Rich reds, earthy yellows, cool blues. Scenes showed her birth, divinely touched. Her coronation, divinely guided. Her reign, divinely blessed. And at the heart of it all, her journey to Punt, painted with care. Ships with billowing sails, trees heavy with incense, and strange creatures never seen on Nile's shores. She was more than a ruler. She was a dreamer who carved her dreams into sandstone and let the desert winds carry them. Visitors who stand there today, in the hush of morning or the lull of twilight, still feel it. The calm, the strength, the quiet boldness of a woman who once dared to stand where only men had stood, and to do it beautifully. Trade, not war. In a time when pharaohs sent armies to prove their might, Hatshepsut sent ships. Not warships, but merchant vessels. Long, sleek boats with wide sails and steady hands guiding them down the Red Sea. Their destination was a land lost in shadow and mystery, the land of Punt. Punt was not a place of battle. It was a place of gifts. Gold, ivory, myrrh, ebony, and frankincense trees, still rooted in their pots so they could grow again in Egyptian soil. Even giraffes walked down gangplanks and into the wondering eyes of the people. It was unlike any royal expedition before or after. Why did she go? Perhaps to strengthen Egypt's wealth. Perhaps to build relationships with distant peoples. But perhaps, too, to show a different kind of power, not one of swords and spears, but one of open hands. While others won lands by force, she opened the sea lanes of peace. Trade flourished. Temples brimmed with sweet-smelling incense. The people saw their nation not as conqueror, but as neighbor. And it wasn't only Punt. Throughout her reign, she focused on building, not just buildings, but bonds. She restored old temples, commissioned obelisks that pierced the sky with sunlight. Under her rule, Egypt was stable, prosperous, unbothered by the thunder of war. In the scroll of pharaohs, hers is one of the gentlest reigns, but no less grand. She proved that a nation could rise not only through conquest, but through calm. That a ruler could be strong without being cruel. And that trade, when done with wisdom, could echo just as loudly as war. Erased but not forgotten. Time is not always kind to those who break its rules. And Hatshepsut, for all her wisdom, for all her peace, had stepped outside of Egypt's oldest traditions. When she died, likely after more than 2 decades on the throne, her stepson Thutmose III, once the child she had guided, became sole ruler. And slowly, almost carefully, her memory began to be undone. Her statues were pulled down. Her name, once carved in thick, proud hieroglyphs, was chiseled out. Her images were scratched from stone walls. It was as though the kingdom tried to pretend she had never ruled. Not because she was hated, but because she was inconvenient. A woman in a man's line of kings. A memory that didn't fit the story. But stone is stubborn. Even erased, her outline remained. Even scratched away, her name left echoes. And the temple at Deir el-Bahari, so large and gentle and serene, still stood and still speaks. Over time, archaeologists uncovered what had been hidden. Her statues rose again. Her inscriptions were pieced together. The land remembered, and so do we. Hatshepsut's life is no longer a footnote. It is a chapter, a shining one. She was the builder of beauty, the sender of ships, the woman who ruled with clarity and calm. She wore the beard, not as a disguise, but as a crown. And now, far from being forgotten, she is honored. As pharaoh, as woman, as one who led not with noise, but with vision. In the quiet of night, if you close your eyes and imagine the wind on temple steps, the soft flutter of sails far at sea, and the whisper of a name once buried in silence, you'll hear her, still ruling, still remembered. Chapter 13, The Heretic and His God. A king turns his face to the sun. He abandons Ammonius, crowns Aten, and moves the capital to a dream city of light. In the long line of Egypt's pharaohs, where tradition flowed like the Nile itself, one man dared to break the current. His name was Akhenaten. Born as Amenhotep IV, he was a royal son of Thebes, raised among towering temples and the endless hymns to Ammonius, the invisible god of wind and air. But something stirred in him that had not stirred in pharaohs before. He looked past the shadows of the great halls, past the incense and stone, and lifted his face toward the sky, toward the golden circle that lit the world. And in that warm, burning light, he found a different god, Aten, the sun disk. No hidden mysteries, no animal forms or secret names. Just light, just warmth, just life itself, stretching across the land in golden silence. Akhenaten called Aten the one true God, not just of Egypt, but of all creation. In a time when Egypt worshipped dozens, he chose only one. It was a quiet rebellion, wrapped in the soft robes of faith. But it would change everything. He changed his own name, from Amenhotep, meaning Ammonius is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for Aten. He spoke not of temples in darkness, but of a god who needed no image, who was seen in every sunrise. And to honor him, Akhenaten did something Egypt had never seen. He left Thebes behind. He turned his back on the great priests and their vast wealth. and he walked into the desert to build a city of light. It was called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Not just a new capital, but a new beginning. White limestone glowed in the heat. Streets ran wide and open. And above it all, the sun reigned without rival, casting no judgment, only light. In letters to other kings, Akhenaten called himself the Sun King. He believed his god was not hidden in statues, but shining on the very earth he walked. And in that belief, he reshaped an empire. But to worship one god meant silencing the others. Temples to Ammonius were closed. Statues were smashed. Inscriptions were scratched out. The old gods, once beloved, were now forbidden. What Akhenaten saw as truth, others saw as betrayal. Yet he pressed on, wrapped in sunbeams and certainty, convinced that Egypt had found its truest path, even if it stood alone in the world. Amarna's soft shadows. In Akhenaten's new city, art changed softer, more human. Pharaohs kissed their children and cried beside their wives. In Akhetaten, known today as Amarna, something unusual bloomed. Not just a city, but a new way of being. Art shifted, as if the harsh outlines of gods and warriors had melted under the sun's gentle gaze. Where once pharaohs stood stiff and timeless, now they walked barefoot with their families. Where once they held spears, now they held children. On temple walls, Akhenaten is shown leaning down, kissing his daughters. His queen, Nefertiti, sits beside him, not behind. Together, under the curved arms of Aten's rays, which often end in tiny hands, they are not divine statues but a family warm and alive. No longer were the pharaohs carved in perfection, muscles hard and expressions blank. Now their bodies curved and swayed. Their bellies were round. Their faces were long, with sleepy eyes and soft mouths. Even Akhenaten's own form was strange. Not the typical shape of a god-king, but something different, something more fragile. Some say it was illness. Others say it was art with a message, that the pharaoh, like Aten, was both father and mother, giver of all. Whatever the reason, the result was unmistakable. Egypt was feeling. Not just ruling, not just praying, but feeling. And those feelings were etched into the very stones of Amarna. Scenes showed joy, musicians playing, lovers embracing, hands reaching toward the sun. But they also showed sorrow, tears, deaths, funerals. The stiff rules of the old style were broken, just like the temples of the old gods. In this sunlight kingdom, truth wasn't perfect. It was human. Akhenaten believed that Aten was not distant, but present in every moment of life. And so he asked his artists not to lie. No more timeless glory. No more eternal strength. Just breath and warmth and shadow. Just the world as it was, painted in the colors of a softer sun. The cost of devotion. The old gods were angered. Priests lost power. And the people murmured. But the sun does not shine on all equally. And beneath Akhenaten's vision, cracks began to form. In Thebes, the old priests stirred. They had lost everything. Their temples, their followers, their gold. Ammonius, once the greatest god of Egypt, was now erased from walls and whispers. His name had fed entire cities. Now it was forbidden to speak. The temples emptied. The offerings stopped. And in their silence, anger grew. The people, too, felt the weight of change. Aten had no temples they could enter. No statues they could touch. No stories to pass down. For generations, they had prayed to many gods. For crops, for children, for health, for rain. Now they were told there was only one. And he did not speak back. He did not live in the village shrine. He shone high above, unreachable. To the king, Aten was everywhere. To the people, he was nowhere at all. Whispers traveled like wind through reed and stone. Food was scarce. Taxes rose. The festivals were gone. The gods they loved had been silenced. And though Akhenaten built gardens and palaces, though the city shimmered in the desert light, many felt something missing. Not just food, not just old customs, but meaning. The soul of Egypt, once so rich and many-colored, now felt pale. Diplomats from abroad began to notice. Letters from allies spoke of neglect. Egyptian power, once feared, now seemed distant and distracted. The king, they said, wrote only of Aten. He sent little help. He listened little. Wrapped in his new world, Akhenaten had become a god's servant more than a ruler of men. And Egypt, land of order, began to feel unsteady. In his devotion, Akhenaten had tried to bring peace. But peace cannot be forced. And as the years passed, even the sun began to cast longer shadows across the shining city. The fall of a dream. When Akhenaten died, his city crumbled with him. A short, strange chapter swept back into silence. The light that had burned so brightly began to fade. After 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten died. No great battle, no grand farewell, just silence, the kind that wraps a dream just before waking. And with his death, the city of Akhetaten, once filled with songs and sunlight, began to die as well. There was no one like him to carry the vision forward. His son, the boy king Tutankhaten, was still a child. Soon, even his name was changed to Tutankhamen in honor of the old god Ammonius. The pendulum had swung back. The temples reopened. The priests returned. The statues of Ammonius stood again in gold and shadow. And Aten, once the only god, was cast out. The city Akhenaten built was left behind. The white stones fell to dust. The soft art was buried. The memory of his reign, strange, sacred, and short, was scrubbed from history. His name was cut from monuments. His face erased. Egypt tried to forget him, to pretend he had never walked under the sun at all. But stone remembers, and so do we. Today, in the sands of Amarna, archaeologists brush away time. They find fragments, a painted hand, a broken face, a hymn to the sun still etched in faded ink. These are the whispers of a dream. A king who tried to change everything. A god who had no temple. A city made of light. And though it lasted only a moment in the long story of Egypt, it shone, bright and strange, like a spark in the darkness. Then it vanished as dreams do, leaving behind only the warmth of what could have been. Chapter 14. The Boy King and the Tomb of Gold. The desert winds whispered a new name across the land, Tutankhaten. A boy, no more than 9, seated on the golden throne of Egypt. The son of Akhenaten, he carried the bloodline of a heretic, yet the hopes of a weary nation. After years of confusion and silence in the temples, the people longed for balance. They did not see a child. They saw a symbol. In him there was promise not of power but of peace. In his wide, dark eyes, the future blinked uncertainly, but the land held its breath and waited. His advisors stood tall beside him. I, the wise old vizier, and Hormheb, the strong general, became his shield and guide. They knew what had to be done. The boy would rule, but they would lead. His name was changed from Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. It was more than a name. It was a declaration. Egypt was turning back. The capital shifted from Akhetaten, the ghostly city of sun worship, back to Memphis and Thebes. The boy king was crowned with both the red and white crowns, joining Upper and Lower Egypt once more. Though the crown rested heavy on such a young brow, he bore it with quiet strength. Behind the scenes, I worked to soothe the priesthood, to refill the temples, to relight the incense that had not burned for years. Tutankhamun's rule was soft, more prayer than conquest. But that was what Egypt needed, not another vision, not another upheaval, but rest. Though young, the boy king approved the changes. Perhaps he did not understand their full meaning, but he understood peace. In his short life, surrounded by loss and turmoil, peace had been rare. Now it returned, slowly, gently, like the Nile after a drought. The land was healing. The gods were returning. And in the center of it all was a boy, quiet, golden, and crowned, restoring the old ways. The sun temples of Aten had fallen silent. Where once Akhenaten had sung praises to the singular disk of light, now shadows crept in. The priests of Ammonius returned, robes flowing like waves across stone floors. With cautious hands, they relit the sacred fires and opened the great doors of Karnak. Statues long hidden were raised again. The scent of incense rose, sweet and strong, curling like prayers into the heavens. Tutankhamun's reign became a time of religious restoration. The hymns of old returned, echoing through columns carved centuries before his birth. Gods with many faces stood proud once more. Osiris, lord of the afterlife. Hathor, mother of joy. Thoth, the wise scribe. Egypt, so long silenced under Akhenaten's experiment, sang again. The temples were not just places of worship. They were homes of learning, healing, and community. Reopening them meant more than devotion. It meant medicine for the sick, food for the hungry, stories for the children. The people came in droves, placing lotus flowers on the altars, whispering old prayers as if remembering their mother tongue. Behind the scenes, it was I who wrote the orders and Horemheb who enforced them. But it was Tutankhamun's name that graced the decrees. His image was painted on the walls, standing before Ammonius, offering gifts, pouring sacred water. He may have been small in stature, but he was great in symbol, a ruler who gave Egypt back its gods. Even as the world shifted back into familiar rhythms, there remained an air of fragility. Tutankhamun had restored the old gods, but he was still young, still human. In paintings, he is shown as powerful, tall, firm in command. But in truth, he suffered. His body was weak, perhaps twisted from birth. Some say he walked with a cane. Others whisper of illness, of frailty hidden behind royal robes. Still, he stood for something larger than his limbs. He stood for Egypt's memory, and that was enough. A death too soon. The boy who brought back the gods did not live to become a man. At the age of 19, Tutankhamun slipped away, quietly, suddenly. The cause of death remains a mystery. Some say infection. Others speak of a broken leg, a blow to the head, or even poison. But no matter how it happened, the truth remains. Egypt lost a king too soon. He had no son, no great legacy of monuments or military campaigns. His reign had been short and gentle. No temples built in his name, no wars won. And yet his death stirred sorrow. Not because of what he did, but because of what might have been. He had held together a fragile peace. He had calmed a wounded land. And in doing so, he became something rare, a soft light in a time of shadows. The burial had to be done quickly. The old advisor, likely led the arrangements. With no grand tomb prepared, they took what they had. A small chamber in the Valley of the Kings, perhaps intended for another. But they filled it with gold. With statues and chariots, jewelry and sandals, board games and food. Everything a king might need for the journey into the afterlife. Though rushed, it was rich. The walls were painted in golden hues. A scene of Tutankhamun meeting Osiris. A passage from life to eternity. His body was laid in a nested series of coffins, 3, each more ornate than the last. The final coffin, solid gold, held the face of the boy king, young, serene, eternal. On his head rested the royal headdress. Across his chest, the crossed crook and flail. In his hands, the hopes of a nation that had once feared forgetting the gods. And then the tomb was sealed, quiet, hidden, lost, a whisper through time. For over 3,000 years, Tutankhamun slept beneath the sand. His name was mostly forgotten, his tomb unvisited, untouched. While other kings were looted, crumbled, or lost, his remained small, hidden, intact. Time passed. Egypt changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Empires came and went. But the boy king waited. It was the year 1922 when the whisper became a voice. A British archaeologist named Howard Carter had searched the Valley of the Kings for years. Funds were running low. Spirits were fading. And then, beneath a pile of rubble near the tomb of Ramses VI, something was found. A step, a sealed doorway, and beyond it, untouched wonder. When Carter finally entered the tomb, the air was thick with ancient stillness. His eyes met walls painted in deep gold, furniture stacked to the ceiling, chariots dismantled, statues standing guard. And at the heart of it all, the golden shrine, a box within a box within a box. And inside, the coffins, and inside them, the boy, The world held its breath. Newspapers printed the discovery in bold. Photographs spread across oceans. Egypt's forgotten child had become its most famous king. Not for war, not for power, but for silence, beauty, and gold. The curse of the pharaohs made headlines. But behind the drama was something more profound. The face of a boy, perfectly preserved, looking out across centuries. His eyes closed, his story just beginning. Tutankhamun became a symbol once again. This time, not of religion or politics, but of wonder. School children across continents learned his name. Museums displayed his treasures. Artists painted his mask. And in the hush of museum halls, people stood in silence, staring at the beauty of his death and the mystery of his life. He had ruled briefly. He had died young. But somehow, through time, through sand, through silence, he endured. In gold and shadow, in myth and memory, the boy king lives on. Chapter 15, Empire in the Sand. The Nile had known many kings, but none quite like him. Ramses II, later called Ramses the Great, arrived not as a whisper in history, but as a trumpet. His reign would stretch for 67 years, longer than many dynasties, and his shadow would linger for centuries beyond. Born into power but forged in ambition, Ramses was not content with being just another pharaoh. He would become the measure by which others were judged. With a mane of red gold hair and the bearing of a sun god, he stood as Egypt's living symbol of divine rule. He was crowned in his youth and, from the moment he grasped the crook and flail, he moved swiftly to reshape the land in his image. He was a builder of wonders, cities, temples, obelisks. Wherever he walked, monuments rose like stalks of grain, each inscribed with his name, as though time itself must remember him. At Pyramus, his new capital in the Delta, walls gleamed with painted scenes of victory. Temples thundered with the chants of priests. He was not merely remembered. He made remembering impossible to avoid. But Ramses also ruled with the warmth of a father. His court overflowed with life. He sired over 100 children, sons and daughters who filled palaces and temples with laughter and ceremony. His favorite queen, Nefertari, was honored with her own temple, her name carved in eternal stone beside his. His love for her was not just whispered in private. It was proclaimed in grand carvings and sacred hieroglyphs, for all to see. In war, he was the lion of Egypt. In peace, he was the shepherd. But above all, Ramses was a man who looked at time and dared to challenge it. With every statue he raised, he asked, "Will you forget me?" And with every echo that still whispers his name, history answers, "No, we will not." The Battle of Kadesh. It was the 21st year of his reign when Ramses faced his greatest test. The sun rose hot over the northern lands, and the scent of dust and iron clung to the wind. Ramses led his armies north to Kadesh, near the Orontes River, where the powerful Hittite Empire stood like a wall before him. Two great civilizations, one born of the Nile, the other of Anatolia, would soon clash in one of the largest chariot battles the world had ever seen. Ramses rode at the head of his division, wrapped in gold and fire, believing victory was within reach. But the Hittites were cunning. Hidden in the hills, they struck like thunder, pouring down upon the Egyptian forces before they had fully formed their battle lines. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed. Spears flew like angry rain. For a moment, the Sun King stood alone. His bodyguards scattered, his army in disarray. But Ramses did not flee. He charged into the fray, shouting prayers to Ammonius, his war god. His courage was not quiet. It was visible, roaring across the battlefield. Under his hand, the Egyptians rallied. They turned back the tide. The battle lasted hours. Dust choked the air. Blood ran into the river. Neither side could claim a clear victory. But what came after was even more remarkable. Rather than continue the war, Ramses and the Hittite king, Hattusili III, chose words over weapons. Together, they signed the first known peace treaty in human history, a delicate agreement etched into stone, declaring that no sword would rise between them again. It was a moment of rare wisdom. Two empires, once locked in rage, now bound by diplomacy. And it was Ramses who stood at its heart, not just a warrior but a peacemaker. In his temples, he depicted the battle as a triumph. In truth, it was a lesson. Victory is not always found in conquest. Sometimes it is in knowing when to stop. Abu Simbel and the Mountains of Kings. Far to the south, where the Nile flowed through the heat of Nubia, Ramses gave birth to something eternal. At the cliffs of Abu Simbel, he carved his memory into the very bones of the earth. For seated colossi, each towering over 60 feet tall, gazed forever across the sands. They were not just statues. They were silent kings, guardians of legacy, gazing into the ages with calm, unblinking eyes. These were not built to impress men. They were built to speak with gods. Twice a year, as the sun rose, its light pierced the temple and touched the inner sanctum, bathing Ramses' image in gold. This was no accident. This was sacred geometry. Ramses made time itself bow. Beside his own monument, he built another for Nefertari, rare in a world where queens were often left in shadows. Her temple showed her standing equal with goddesses, her name carved in the stone beside Isis and Hathor. She was not merely his wife. She was a symbol of harmony, of love held in marble and light. Abu Simbel was a message, said, "I was here, I ruled, I loved, I endured." And as the centuries passed and the desert winds whispered over the cliffs, the message remained. Even when the sands swallowed the statues, even when silence filled the halls, the story waited. Thousands of years later, when engineers moved the temple stone by stone to save it from rising waters, they did not just move stone. They moved memory. They carried Ramses' voice into the present. The cliffs still echo with it. The gaze of the giants still watches. The sun still visits the chamber, keeping the king's promise alive. Time's slow erosion, but even the brightest star will one day dim. After Ramses' reign, the new kingdom began to stretch, then strain. His sons ruled in his shadow, unable to match the giant who had come before. The power of the priests grew. The coffers grew thin. The outer lands, once held by might, began to slip from Egypt's grasp like sand through fingers. The great empire built by Thutmose and expanded by Ramses began to fracture. Invasions from the sea peoples battered the coasts. Trade routes faltered. Famine crept in. The voice of the gods grew quiet, or perhaps people stopped listening. Tombs were looted. Temples crumbled. And yet Egypt did not fall all at once. It bent slowly, like reeds in a rising flood. The long peace after Kadesh gave way to local quarrels. Foreign rulers rose in distant lands, and Egypt's influence shrank. By the time the 20th dynasty drew to a close, the new kingdom, once the jewel of the ancient world, was a memory dressed in stone. But memories have power. They linger in the silence. They wait beneath the earth. Ramses' statues still rise against the sun. His name is still spoken. Even as the empire faded, the dream remained. Time is a tide that spares no throne, no crown. But some names rise again, like distant stars at dusk. And Ramses the Great, builder of wonders, rider of chariots, carver of mountains, remains one of those stars, still glowing softly over the empire of sand. Chapter 16, Twilight of the Pharaohs. They came not as conquerors but as caretakers of something already slipping. When the Libyans wore the crowns of Egypt, they did so not in defiance, but in uneasy duty. Foreigners had once been repelled, feared, cast out. But now Egypt, worn from centuries of splendor and war, invited them in. These men, often former generals and chieftains from the West, were not invaders in the usual sense. They had already lived within Egypt's borders, had served in its armies, and had walked its streets. Slowly, over generations, they blended into its ranks. Eventually, they rose. The 22nd dynasty began with Shoshenq I, a man of Libyan descent who called himself king. He took the throne not in violence but in opportunity, and the weakening breath of the priests of Ammonius allowed it. Shoshenq marched into Jerusalem and made his mark far beyond Egypt. But even then, the grandeur of conquest seemed smaller, quieter than in the golden past. Pharaohs of the Libyan line ruled not over an empire, but over fragments. Egypt had splintered. In the north, cities acted like independent courts. In the south, Thebes still followed its own heartbeat. And in the middle, pharaohs tried to stitch the pieces together with royal names and ceremonies that had lost much of their power. These were years of division cloaked in formality. The royal tombs grew smaller, the monuments fewer, and while the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt were still worn, the unity they symbolized was now little more than a memory painted on temple walls. Foreigners ruled, yes, but the Egypt they governed was no longer whole. Over time, new dynasties appeared, born not from conquest but from confusion. Libyan warlords became pharaohs. Local rulers claimed divine favor. Lines of succession twisted into branches that could not hold the weight of a fading kingdom. What once stood as the world's most enduring civilization now flickered like a flame in the wind. It was not yet gone, but it was growing cold. Still, the rituals continued. Priests recited the old hymns. Offerings were laid before statues. Names of the gods were still chanted in the dark. But those chants echoed through halls emptier than before, as if even the stone could remember the silence that had grown between the lines. The Libyan kings were shadows of Ramses and Thutmose. They wore the crown, yes, but they inherited a throne that was already crumbling beneath them. The Kushite revival. Far to the south, beyond the first cataract, a land of black stone and deep tradition waited. Nubia, or as the Egyptians called it, Kush, had once been conquered, colonized, shaped by pharaohs of the north. But time, as always, shifted the winds. Now it was Nubia's turn to rise. And with its rise came a dream, not of revenge, but of restoration. The 25th dynasty began not with swords, but with sacred intention. Pi, a Kushite king with fire in his eyes and reverence in his heart, saw the broken lands of Egypt and wept not for conquest, but for unity. He believed Egypt was still sacred, that the gods had not abandoned her, but that the people had forgotten to listen. So he marched north not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. And at every temple he entered, he prayed. He washed himself clean in sacred waters. He bowed before the old gods and swore that the land would rise again. Pi's reign was not long, but his impact was deep. His son Taharka followed, continuing the mission. Together, they built temples in both Nubia and Egypt. They restored carvings. They wrote in hieroglyphs older than their own lineage. They ruled not only as kings of Nubia, but as pharaohs of Egypt, sons of Ra, chosen by Ammonius. For a moment, it seemed as though the Nile had remembered how to sing. But even dreams must contend with the world around them. From the east, a new power was rising. Assyria, brutal and cold, with iron spears and hearts hardened by war. Taharka stood against them, tried to hold the line. But Egypt was no longer the land it once was. Even with Kushite strength, the old kingdom could not resist forever. The Assyrians came, and with them another chapter closed. Still, the Kushite kings left something behind, not in gold or empire, but in memory. They were among the last to believe that Egypt could still be sacred, that the gods still watched, that the Nile, though weary, could still carry the spirit of the land. In their hearts, Egypt never died. Gods and ghosts, the temples still stood, massive and quiet, watching the winds shift across the desert. Their walls, once vibrant with color and ceremony, were now worn by time. Statues still reached to the heavens. Columns still held up the sky. But inside, something had changed. The gods, once alive in every whisper and shadow, now felt distant. Their eyes of gold no longer glowed with presence. They had become still, not in form, but in soul. Faith had become habit. Rituals were performed not with belief, but with duty. Priests chanted, but the songs felt thinner. Incense still rose, but the air was dry. Offerings were laid before statues of Ammonius, Osiris, Hathor, but the people no longer waited for signs. The gods, it seemed, had become ghosts. Or perhaps it was the people who had forgotten how to hear them. In Thebes, Karnak still loomed, a maze of stone prayers etched into silence. But even here, Where once pharaohs came to be crowned and nations gathered in awe, there was now a quiet emptiness. The sacred lake reflected only the sky. The sanctuaries held echoes, not voices. The gods had not vanished. They were still worshipped, still named, but they had lost their power to shape the world. And with this fading of the divine came a slow erosion of identity. For thousands of years, Egypt had been a land where kings were gods and gods were kings, where the afterlife was not a hope, but a destination. But now, the veil between the world and the sacred had thinned. Not in mysticism, but in memory. People still believed, but belief had become survival. Reverence had become routine. This was not a collapse. It was a soft decay, like the slow fading of paint on a wall. Like a song once sung with joy, now whispered out of obligation. The gods had not died, but they had become distant stars, beautiful, unreachable, and cold. A kingdom of shifting sand. The Nile still flowed, the sun still rose, but Egypt no longer commanded the world. It whispered now. Its power had become a memory, scattered in tombs, temples, and tales told under desert moons. New rulers came, Persians, Greeks, and later Romans, each one placing their own crown on the land, each one trying to bend Egypt's soul to their will. But Egypt did not fight back as it once had. It adapted, survived, and yet, in this survival, it lost something of its ancient voice. By the time the last native pharaohs faded into history, the land had become a prize, not a power. Cities once filled with scholars and artisans now watched foreign garrisons march through their streets. Temples became museums of old gods. Sacred scrolls were copied not out of belief, but out of fascination. Egypt was no longer a kingdom. It was a story, one still told but no longer lived. And yet, there was something eternal in its sand. The pyramids still stood. The Sphinx still watched. And deep in the valleys, under stone and silence, names like Thutmose, Hatshepsut, and Ramses still slept in golden masks. Egypt, though diminished, had not vanished. It had become something else, a relic, yes, but also a symbol. A memory the world could not forget. The twilight of the pharaohs did not come with fire, came with a sigh, a long, quiet exhale after millennia of brilliance. And in that silence, something tender remained, a sense that this land, even in decline, still held the heartbeat of something older than time. As the last rays of Egypt's ancient sun dipped below the horizon, the sands did not mourn. They remembered. They held the bones of kings, the laughter of children, the prayers of farmers, the secrets of priests. And when the wind passed over the dunes, it carried not the end, but the echo. An echo of drums, of voices, of life, of Egypt. Always Egypt. Chapter 17. The Greeks and the Goddess. The wind across the desert was dry the day the boy from Macedon arrived. He came not with legions of war, but with something deeper, momentum. Egypt, once mighty, had grown weary from centuries of foreign hands. The Persians had ruled her lands, taxed her temples, and taken her treasures. The priests had prayed for deliverance, not from the gods of old, but from the rulers who had no love for Ra, Osiris, or the sacred Nile. And then, like the dawn after a long night, Alexander came. He crossed the Egyptian border without resistance. Not a single spear was raised against him. To the people of Egypt, this young man with golden hair and a lion's walk felt like a promise. He was not Persian. And more than that, he treated Egypt not as a prize but as a sacred inheritance. He offered sacrifice to the native gods, walked with the priests, and paid respects to the temple of Apis, the sacred bull. In Memphis, Alexander stood before the people. The high priests of Ptah placed the double crown upon his head, the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower. He accepted it solemnly, though he spoke in Greek. He was now Pharaoh, son of Ra, lord of the two lands. The people cheered not because he had conquered them, but because he had acknowledged them. He did not try to erase the past. Instead, he cloaked himself in it. And then he made a journey one deep into the western desert, to the oracle of Siwa, where it was said only those chosen by the gods could walk and return. Alexander crossed that long path of sand and silence. And when he came back, he said little. Only that the oracle had called him the son of Zeus Ammon, the god who was both Greek and Egyptian, thunder and sun. It was a title that lingered in the air like incense. He was now more than king. He was a symbol, a bridge between two worlds. The rise of Alexandria, the city that rose from Alexander's dream, was not ancient. It was new, a place carved from the edge of the Nile Delta, facing the Mediterranean like a door to the world. He named it after himself, Alexandria. But this was not just vanity. He knew what he was building. It was to be a city of light, of knowledge, of many voices speaking under one sky. Alexandria became a crossroads. Greeks brought their logic and geometry, their drama and debate. Egyptians brought their myths, their star calendars, and the wisdom of the priests. And soon Jews arrived too, families from Jerusalem and beyond, adding their scripture and traditions to the growing mosaic. They lived in separate quarters, but they met in the markets, in the lecture halls, in the libraries. At the heart of the city was something unlike anything the world had ever seen: the Library of Alexandria, a place where scrolls arrived daily, where scholars copied every book that passed through the harbor. It was said that the library held the sum of all human thought: philosophy from Athens, science from Babylon, medicine from Memphis, poetry from Persia. The scholars there were not warriors, but they were no less powerful. They read, translated, debated, and dreamed. Among them, ideas were born that would shape the future for centuries. And rising nearby was the lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the seven wonders. A column of stone and fire, standing tall at the edge of the sea, guiding ships with its flame. It wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol. Egypt had once been a land of tombs and temples. Now it lit the world with learning. But under the brilliance of Alexandria, something subtle began to change. The old gods were still worshipped, the festivals still held, but the heart of Egypt was no longer in Thebes or Memphis. It had shifted north, to this glittering Greek city by the sea. Ptolemaic thrones. After Alexander's death, his empire shattered like glass. His generals, called the Diadochi, took the pieces. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. Ptolemy was not Egyptian, not even a little. He was Macedonian, foreign in tongue and blood. But he knew Egypt's power lay in appearance as much as rule. So he became pharaoh. Ptolemy did not conquer the temples. He embraced them. He had himself depicted on temple walls as if he were born of Isis and crowned by Horus. He kept the ancient festivals. He offered sacrifices. He even mummified sacred animals as the old kings had done. And yet, behind the golden mask, Greek was spoken in the palace halls. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed was a strange dance, Greek in speech but pharaoh in form. They ruled for nearly 3 centuries, sometimes wise, sometimes cruel. Some Ptolemies were scholars like Ptolemy I, who helped build the library. Others were tyrants, obsessed with gold and survival. The court was often twisted with family plots, brothers marrying sisters, queens poisoning kings, sons rebelling against fathers. But through it all, the throne held. The Ptolemies styled themselves as heirs of both Alexander and the ancient kings. They wore the crowns. They offered to the gods. But their faces, carved in stone, looked nothing like Ramses or Thutmose. And yet the people bowed, because even if the soul of Egypt had changed, the ritual remained. The priests still chanted. The Nile still flooded. The temples still echoed with offerings. It was a kingdom of mirrors, foreign rule wrapped in native robes, a performance that fooled no one, but comforted many. The cult of the dead gods. By the end of the Ptolemaic reign, Egypt was quiet, not silent but hollow. The gods were still there, carved in stone, painted on temple walls, but they no longer roared in the hearts of men. The chants continued, the incense rose, but the spark had dimmed. The world had moved on. Rome was rising. Alexandria was still bright, but the rest of Egypt had grown tired. Thebes was a ghost, Memphis a memory. Even the pyramids, once symbols of divine power, now stood as relics, watched by shepherds and visited by tourists from the West. The temples, once the centers of life, had become museums of ritual. Priests carried out their duties, but fewer believed. The gods felt distant, like shadows painted on the past. The cults continued, especially those of Isis and Osiris. But it was not the same. Even these gods were being exported, worshipped in Greece and Rome with new names and meanings. The heart of Egyptian faith had been lifted from the Nile and scattered across empires. What remained was theater, sacred, beautiful, but no longer alive. And yet Egypt did not vanish. She became something else, a stage. Her past inspired poets in Athens, emperors in Rome, philosophers in distant lands. The mysteries of the pyramids, the magic of the hieroglyphs, the haunting gaze of the Sphinx. They all lived on, not as religion, but as legend. The last of the Ptolemies was a queen, Cleopatra. She would fight to keep Egypt free. She would speak many languages, rule as a goddess, and fall to the ambitions of Rome. With her, the line ended. The pharaohs were gone, but Egypt endured, not as she had been, but as a memory wrapped in stone, carried in scrolls, whispered in stories. She was no longer the heart of the world, but she was its echo, a land that once dreamed of eternity, and came closer than any other. Chapter 18, Cleopatra and the End of the Line. Cleopatra VII came into the world as if born from ancient fire, a final spark before the night fell over Egypt's long dynasty. She was the last of the Ptolemies, a Macedonian Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great. But unlike her royal brothers who co-ruled and faded in the shadows of politics, Cleopatra stood apart. She was not just a queen in title. She was a ruler in spirit, mind, and strategy. Fluent in many languages, including the Egyptian tongue, which her Greek forebears had never bothered to learn. She connected with her people in a way that made her more than a foreign queen. She became their final embodiment of Egyptian rule. From the towering temples of Thebes to the bustling markets of Alexandria, Cleopatra's name stirred awe and fear. She was brilliant, witty, and deeply educated in philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. She understood power not just through armies or titles, but through image and presence. In public appearances, she styled herself as the goddess Isis, merging the divine with the earthly, blending tradition with spectacle. But beneath all the gold and incense was a woman who knew she was walking the edge of a crumbling world. Egypt in her time was not the empire it once had been. The Great Pyramids had long been silent. Nubia no longer bowed. The trade routes east and west were less certain. And most of all, Rome was rising, powerful, vast, and hungry. Cleopatra's Egypt was rich in wheat and wonder, but weak in comparison to the expanding Roman Republic. The land of the pharaohs had become a pawn in the wider game of Roman politics. And Cleopatra, despite her intelligence and strength, knew she had to play this game well or be swept away by it. Her rule began in turmoil. At just 18 years old, she shared the throne with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. But the relationship quickly soured. Power struggles turned deadly. Cleopatra was exiled from the palace and forced to regroup beyond Egypt's capital. Yet she would return, not with an army, but with a plan, and soon with an alliance that would change everything. Love and politics. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt chasing his rival Pompey, Cleopatra saw more than a visitor from Rome. She saw an opportunity. Smuggled into Caesar's quarters wrapped in a rug, or so legend says, she presented herself not just as a queen without a throne, but as a partner who could offer Egypt's wealth in return for Rome's favor. Caesar, impressed by her wit, her charm, and her sheer boldness, sided with her. He helped defeat her brother's forces and placed Cleopatra back on the throne, now ruling alongside another younger brother. Their partnership grew into romance. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, the only known biological child of the Roman leader. She traveled to Rome with him, stirring awe and scandal alike. To the Romans, Cleopatra was both exotic and threatening. She stood for the East, for luxury, for mystery, for female power. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra quickly fled back to Egypt. The world was shifting again. Caesar was gone, and now Rome was in another civil war. In time, another Roman general would arrive on the Nile's edge, Mark Antony. Where Caesar had been cold and calculating, Antony was fiery and impulsive. And Cleopatra, ever strategic, once again formed an alliance. But this time, the relationship went deeper. It wasn't just politics. It was passion. Their union produced children, and more importantly, a shared vision. Antony saw in Cleopatra not just a queen, but a partner with whom he could rule the East. Together, they held dreams of a new empire, one where Rome and Egypt would stand as equals. But back in Rome, not all were pleased. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, saw Antony's allegiance to Cleopatra as betrayal. The affair was scandalous. The idea of a Roman leader giving away power, land, and love to a foreign queen shocked Roman pride. It became more than rivalry, it became war. The world watched as two powers, the Roman Republic and the dream of a Roman-Egyptian alliance, prepared to clash. Actium and ashes. The final confrontation came at sea, near the coast of Greece, at a place called Actium. There, in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced off against Octavian's navy. What followed was not only a battle of ships, but a battle of futures. Wind and wave carried not just war cries, but the echoes of a dying dynasty. The sea turned red with fire and steel. But despite their strength and resolve, Antony and Cleopatra's forces were outmatched. Their ships were slower, their lines broke, and in a moment of sudden despair or decision, Cleopatra's fleet turned and fled. Antony followed. The battle was lost. They returned to Egypt, their hopes now dimmed. Yet Cleopatra did not give up. Even as Octavian's armies marched closer, she tried to negotiate. She offered treasure, surrender, anything that might preserve her throne, her children, her legacy. But Octavian had no interest in half measures. He wanted Egypt whole and without resistance. In the final moments, as defeat closed in, Cleopatra withdrew into her mausoleum, a grand, stone chamber she had prepared as her final resting place. It was said to be filled with gold, with statues, with scrolls and treasures. But more than anything, it was filled with silence. Antony, believing she was already dead, fell upon his own sword. Dying, he was carried to her side. There, in that tomb of fading glory, their final hours passed in shadow. Cleopatra mourned, but she also prepared. She adorned herself in royal robes, took her seat upon a golden couch and waited. She refused to be paraded through Rome in chains, refused to let Egypt's last queen become a prisoner of foreign hands. And so, as legend tells, she ended her life by the bite of an asp, a venomous snake hidden in a basket of figs. Whether true or not, the story lingers because it feels like Egypt. Mysterious, symbolic, eternal. The final gaze. With Cleopatra's death, something ancient ended. Not just a reign, not just a dynasty, but a world. She was the last in a line that stretched back over 3,000 years. From the days of Narmer, the first pharaoh, who united Upper and Lower Egypt, to the long-forgotten kings who built pyramids under desert suns, to the warrior queens, the priest kings, the godchildren of Ra and Osiris. All of it ended with Cleopatra's final breath. Rome took Egypt. Octavian, now called Augustus, turned the land of the Nile into a Roman province. The temples still stood, the statues still loomed, but the soul of Egypt, its independence, its native line of rulers, its divine crown, was gone. The pharaohs, once gods among men, were now memories carved in stone. Cleopatra's children were captured. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, was executed. The others were taken to Rome. The line of blood was cut. The great throne stood empty. In time, the hieroglyphs would stop being written. The old gods would fade. The deserts would cover the roads once walked by kings. But somewhere in the wind, in the rhythm of the river, in the golden light of a fading sun, echoes of the pharaohs remain. Cleopatra did not save Egypt, but she kept its fire burning until the very end. She stood in the doorway of history, holding back the dark for just a little longer. She was queen, mother, strategist, dreamer, and when the final crown fell, it fell in silence. Yet silence does not always mean the end. Sometimes it means memory, and memory, like the Nile, flows forever.